New York City, the early 1930s. Midnight air thick with cigar smoke. The hum of jazz bleeding out of Harlem clubs, and the rumble of Model T engines echoing down dimly lit streets. Beneath the glitter of the city that never sleeps, another world thrives. One of whispered deals, coded loyalties, and power bought in blood. This was the city Lucky Luciano built. They called him the architect, not because he designed buildings, but because he designed a system, a blueprint for organized crime so efficient it would outlive him by decades. Before Luciano, the Mafia was chaos, feuding clans, archaic codes, and old-world vendettas imported from Sicily. After him, it became an empire, a business, a machine that turned the vices of America into profit, control, and silence. The documentary opens with this transformation, not as a celebration, but as a descent into a world where morality was negotiable, loyalty was weaponized, and power was the only faith that mattered. Through smoke-filled backrooms and blood-stained boardrooms, we trace the evolution of a man who saw the criminal world not as a battlefield, but as an economy. Luciano's story begins in poverty, but it's not rags to riches in the traditional sense. It's the tale of a man who learned that fear could be managed like currency, and that chaos could be profitable if you had the right system. From the cobblestone alleys of the Lower East Side to the mahogany offices of Midtown, his journey is a portrait of ambition unbound and of the American dream, told from its darkest corner. Every empire starts with an idea. Luciano's idea was control. To take the scattered fragments of New York's underworld and shape them into one unified network. To replace the unpredictable brutality of the old mafia with the cold precision of a business syndicate. To turn vice into industry and fear into loyalty. The voiceover deepens. He didn't just change the mafia. He changed America. Because Luciano's influence didn't end at crime. His reach touched politics, unions, law enforcement, and Hollywood itself. He created a structure that mirrored the corporate world, with divisions, managers, profits, and silent shareholders. Every illegal operation in America, from bootlegging to narcotics, began to run like a Fortune 500 company. But every design has a flaw. Every architect, a weakness. For Luciano, that weakness was trust, or perhaps the illusion of it. He surrounded himself with men as brilliant as they were dangerous. Meyer Lansky, the quiet strategist. Bugsy Siegel, the volatile visionary. Frank Costello, the diplomat in a three-piece suit. Together, they built an empire that could rival Wall Street in efficiency. But unlike Wall Street, it had no safety net. One betrayal, one deal gone wrong, and the entire structure could crumble. The city became his stage, and fear became his script. Judges, cops, dock workers, and gangsters all played their part. But beneath the polished exterior of control lay something more fragile: paranoia. Luciano's brilliance was shadowed by his growing realization that power never truly belonged to anyone. It was only rented, borrowed, until someone stronger decided to take it. This documentary will peel back the myth, separating the legend from the man. Behind every headline and every mugshot lies a story of psychology as much as violence. Luciano's genius was not just an organization, but an understanding human desire, greed, fear, loyalty, and betrayal. He didn't rule through terror alone, but through insight. He knew what every man wanted and what every man feared losing. As the camera pans over black and white photographs, Luciano in sharp suits, his eyes half-shadowed, the narration turns somber. History remembers him as a criminal. But perhaps he was something more, a reflection of a system he mastered. Because what Luciano built was not just a criminal empire, but a mirror to America itself. Its hunger for success, its worship of control, its willingness to blur morality in pursuit of power. And so begins the story of Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who took the underworld out of the shadows and made it run like a business. The man who turned loyalty into law and betrayal into strategy. The man who thought he could master the game forever until the game mastered him. A final shot fades to the Manhattan skyline at dawn. The city is waking up. Traffic hums, newspapers hit doorsteps, and in a small cafe somewhere, men in suits whisper over coffee. Deals are still being made, rules still being broken, because the world Luciano built never truly died. It just changed its clothes. Before Lucky Luciano, there was no mafia as we understand it today, no structured hierarchy, no national organization, no disciplined order of business. The criminal underworld of early 20th century America was a tangle of chaos. Ethnic gangs divided by language, neighborhood, and ego. Each group ruled its own few blocks with fists and bullets, answering to no one but its own code of survival. To understand the empire Luciano built, we first have to walk through the ruins of the world that came before him. New York in the 1910s and early 1920s was a city alive with opportunity and desperation. Immigrants poured in from Europe, Sicilians, Jews, Irish, Poles, each bringing their own traditions, their own hustles, and their own grudges. The Lower East Side was a mosaic of tenements where children slept 3 to a bed, and where survival meant learning fast who owned which street corner. Crime wasn't an aberration. It was an industry for the poor. If you couldn't get a job, you found one in the rackets, selling protection, smuggling liquor, running numbers, or acting as muscle for whoever paid most. At the top of this anarchic landscape were the so-called mustache Petes, old-world Sicilian bosses who ruled with superstition and pride. They clung to the ancient codes of Sicily. Omerta, respect for elders, blood vengeance. Their world was one of family honor and closed societies, where outsiders were distrusted and innovation was seen as betrayal. These men, like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, saw themselves as feudal lords transplanted into New York. Their soldiers paid tribute, their enemies bled, and their rules were never questioned. But the America they occupied was changing faster than they could understand. The 1920s brought Prohibition, a nationwide ban on alcohol that, ironically, created the greatest economic boom the criminal world had ever seen. Suddenly, bootlegging became a billion-dollar opportunity. Small-time gangsters became industrialists overnight. Trucks, ships, and warehouses turned into arteries for the black market liquor trade. Yet this gold rush of crime also brought chaos. Gangs fought for control of territory. Killing became routine, and alliances lasted only as long as the money did. The old mafia bosses treated this new business with the same narrow vision they'd brought from Sicily. To them, power was personal, not corporate. They believed in loyalty through blood, not through profit. They fought wars over insults, not balance sheets. Every territory was a fiefdom. Every rival was an enemy to be destroyed, not negotiated with. Their approach was tribal, emotional, and short-sighted, a structure destined to collapse under the weight of modern America. Meanwhile, a new generation of immigrants was growing up in the same neighborhoods, but speaking a different language, the language of America itself. They understood capitalism, opportunity, and pragmatism. They weren't bound by the ghosts of Sicily or Ireland or Russia. They saw crime not as tradition, but as business. And among them was a young man named Charles Lucky Luciano. Before Luciano rose, gang life was a world of caricatured violence. Turf wars between Italian and Irish mobs left streets littered with bodies. The Irish controlled the police and politics. The Italians controlled the docks and the black markets. The Jews controlled the financial brains of the underground. Cooperation was rare. Mistrust was constant. Each group saw the others as threats, not partners. If you were Sicilian, you stayed with Sicilians. If you were Jewish, you kept your distance. Prejudice was as strong in the underworld as it was in polite society. But in this fractured world, something else was happening, something invisible, subtle. A few ambitious minds were starting to ask a dangerous question. What if all this killing was bad for business? What if order could make them richer than chaos ever could? In the smoke-filled bars of downtown Manhattan, young hustlers whispered about cooperation, about merging rackets, about a new kind of leadership that didn't need to rely on old traditions. Yet the old guard resisted fiercely. The mustache Petes despised these ideas. They saw in the younger men a betrayal of everything Sicilian honor stood for, a dilution of their purity. To them, working with Jews or Irish was sacrilege. But to the younger generation, men like Luciano, Lansky, and Costello, race didn't matter. Money did. The underworld was evolving from a culture of revenge to a culture of profit. The environment was perfect for revolution. Every rule was outdated, every leader too rigid, every opportunity too vast to be controlled by the old ways. New York was roaring with energy, jazz, speakeasies, corruption, and greed. Politicians turned a blind eye to the flow of illegal liquor as long as their pockets stayed full. Police captains dined with gang bosses. Judges were bribed with envelopes of cash, and the line between lawful and lawless blurred more each day. In this moral fog, a new type of gangster was inevitable, someone who understood both the psychology of the street and the logic of a CEO. Someone who could take the brutality of the underworld and merge it with the efficiency of modern enterprise. Someone like Lucky Luciano. As the camera pans over archival photographs, black cars parked outside smoky bars, headlines screaming of gang murders, the narration slows. Before Luciano, the Mafia was a medieval relic trying to survive in a modern world. After him, it would become the system we still recognize today. The world before Luciano wasn't just violent, it was inefficient. It bled money through ego, through stubbornness, through the inability to evolve. Luciano saw that flaw, and he would fix it. But to do that, he would have to destroy the very men who taught him everything he knew. The prologue ends on a foreboding note. The streets are silent after a night of gunfire. Somewhere in the city, a young man watches from the shadows, learning, waiting. The old world is burning, and in its ashes, a new empire is about to rise. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in a small Sicilian village called Lurkera Fritti, a place of dust, hunger, and superstition. It was a world that had little to offer except hard labor and obedience. His father, a sulfur miner, dreamed of a better life across the Atlantic, a promise whispered by returning immigrants who spoke of America as a land where money grew on trees. In 1906, the Lucania family boarded a ship bound for New York. They arrived at Ellis Island like thousands of others, dazed, exhausted, and carrying nothing but hope. But New York was not the dream they'd been promised. The Lower East Side was a jungle of poverty, packed tenements, the smell of coal smoke and sewage, and a chorus of street vendors shouting in a dozen languages. Young Salvatore, barely 9 years old, was thrown into a world where survival was not guaranteed, where kids learned quickly that respect came not from school, but from strength. The Lower East Side was America's melting pot, but not the kind found in textbooks. It was divided into territories: Irish, Jewish, Italian, Chinese. And each street had its own rules, its own gangs. Fistfights broke out daily, sometimes over pride, sometimes over food. For the children of immigrants, the American dream was something you had to steal to touch. Salvatore's first education came from the streets. He realized early that charisma could be as powerful as muscle. He spoke English faster than most of his neighbors, and soon began translating for older immigrants, learning how to negotiate, how to read people, how to play both sides. Even as a boy, he carried himself with a strange confidence, a calm that unnerved those around him. By his teenage years, Salvatore had become Charlie. The name sounded more American, more dangerous, and more adaptable. His friends called him Lucky, partly because he survived a savage beating and stabbing in his teens, and partly because he seemed untouchable, always escaping trouble by an inch. But the nickname meant more than that. It was an identity. Lucky Luciano. The name itself sounded like a brand, one he would turn into legend. In these years, Luciano met two people who would define his future: Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Both were Jewish kids from the same tough streets, and all three shared a simple belief: that ethnicity didn't matter, money did. They were rebels against the tribalism of the old gangs. Together, they hustled cigarettes, ran craps games, and collected protection money from street vendors. They were small-time crooks then, but they already thought like businessmen. What set Luciano apart wasn't brutality, it was vision. He didn't waste energy on petty pride. While others fought over blocks, Luciano thought about systems. How could he organize the chaos? How could he make crime efficient? He understood instinctively that power wasn't about who had the most men, but who controlled the flow of money. He once said, "You can't run the world on guns alone. You need brains." That philosophy began to shape him. While most gangsters were reactive, Luciano was strategic. He avoided unnecessary fights, settled disputes quietly, and made alliances that others thought impossible. He built bridges between Italians and Jews, between uptown bootleggers and downtown hustlers. Even as a young man, he had a sense for the long game, a gift that would one day redefine the entire criminal landscape. But his rise wasn't smooth. Luciano's early life was a balancing act between street respect and legitimate ambition. He wore nice suits even when he couldn't afford them. He attended dances, spoke politely to police, and cultivated an image of control. He wanted to be feared, but also admired. In a world of brutes, he presented himself as a gentleman, the kind of criminal who could dine in public without drawing suspicion. During the Prohibition years, the streets turned into gold mines. The 18th Amendment had outlawed alcohol, but the demand never vanished. People still wanted to drink, and Luciano saw what others didn't, that this was not just a crime, but a business opportunity. He joined forces with Arnold Rothstein, the sophisticated gambler known as the brain of the Jewish underworld. Rothstein became Luciano's mentor, teaching him how to think in percentages, how to launder money, and how to stay invisible while building empires. Luciano absorbed these lessons like scripture. From Rothstein, he learned that violence should be a last resort, that real power comes from influence, not intimidation. He learned how to manipulate politicians, how to use money to buy silence, and how to turn moral outrage into profit. By his mid-20s, he was no longer just a gangster. He was an executive of the streets. But every step upward left traces of darkness. Luciano had seen death too many times to romanticize it. Friends disappeared overnight. Deals ended with bullets. In one of his rare reflective moments later in life, he told an interviewer, "You either get smart or you get dead." That was the code he lived by. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in calculation. Yet beneath this smooth exterior, there was something colder, a growing detachment. He began to see people as pieces on a chessboard, each with a function, each expendable if necessary. Loyalty was valuable, but temporary. Everyone had a price. This mindset, both brilliant and dangerous, became the foundation of his empire and the seed of his eventual downfall. By the late 1920s, Luciano was no longer just another face in the crowd. He had made himself indispensable to both Italian and Jewish networks, serving as the link between worlds that had once despised each other. His operations in bootlegging, gambling, and narcotics grew rapidly. Police reports began mentioning him by name, not as a suspect, but as a strategist. Still, there was one obstacle in his path: the old guard. The Sicilian mustache Pete's, who controlled the mafia, refused to recognize him as an equal. To them, Luciano was too American, too modern, too willing to defy tradition. They sneered at his alliances with non-Italians and saw his ambition as arrogance. But Luciano knew the truth: their time was ending. They were generals fighting the last war. In the flickering light of a Manhattan bar, a young Luciano once told Lansky, "They think the old ways will save them. But America doesn't care about the old ways. It only cares about results." It was more than a statement. It was prophecy. As the narration closes, the camera lingers on a photo of Luciano in his 20s, sharp suit, cigarette in hand, eyes confident but cold. The voiceover says softly, "In the slums of New York, a boy named Salvatore learned the rules of survival. But in his ambition to master them, he was already writing new ones." The streets had given him everything: hunger, intelligence, ruthlessness, and charm. But they had also given him the one lesson he would never forget. In a world built on power, mercy was a liability. And from that moment on, Lucky Luciano stopped trying to survive America and began trying to own it. By the early 1930s, New York's underworld was alive with contradictions. The old order, a place where the Sicilian mustache-side politics was collapsing under the rhythm of jazz, drowned out the echoes of gunfire. Every street corner, intoxicated by power, every racket had become an illusion of control. Two men Lucky Luciano moved Giuseppe Joe the boss, Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano. Confident their war for control of the Italian Mafia, he had climbed from the filth of the Lower East Side into the smoky parlors of Manhattan's Lucky Luciano. But what made him different wasn't his rise. Found himself. It was what he was learning along the way. Not just as a soldier. Luciano had begun to understand that brute force could win battles, who ruled strategy, force, and fear. Empires. But Luciano saw that Sicilian bosses' methods were still ruled by fear, driven by ego instead of clinging to outdated codes brought over from the old country. They demanded working line non-Italians, spoke only in younger generations, and despised cooperation with anyone outside their bloodline. Power was personal. To them, the Mafia was sacred. And across town, not an Salvatore Maranzano, but Luciano had grown up different kind of old school leadership. And he saw the streets. He modeled himself after Julius Caesar. Loyalty wasn't born in Sicily and hierarchy. It was bought in New York. To Maranzano, money, the Mafia wasn't a gang. Was the language. It was a Roman legion. He began to realize that organizing this all Italian crime required a new kind of one supreme ruler, one that transcended ethnicity. His soldiers dressed better, superstition, killed cleaner. That realization found form in his partnership with Meyer Lansky that order was Benjamin. Same Bugsy Siegel, the same Jewish gangsters whose ambition the criminal world was evolving. Lansky was quiet, as the Castellammarese war raged from 1929 to the mind of an accountant inside New York became a city under siege. Siegel, bombings, ambushes, and assassinations became unpredictable. Magnetic that once bustled with bootleggers together, they represented the perfect balance. The violence drew police attention, muscle, endangered profits. For Luciano, business impossible. These friendships were revolutionary. To the old bosses, it was about Sicilian bosses. To Luciano, the idea of working with Jews or Irish. Luciano played. They called it both sides with Luciano called it evolution. Outwardly, he understood that crime, like business, privately needed diversity. He built quiet relationships with Maranzano's. The Italians controlled the unions, and with key allies like Meyer Lansky and the Jews handled finance, who stayed neutral and focusing on keeping their rackets. The Irish had the cops. Luciano's goal wasn't to pick a side, separate. It was to end the war altogether by eliminating the men who refused to see late night meetings between in April 1931 became the Luciano of a made his move. They invited Masuria to lunch at a small Coney dimly lit by single bulbs. Ate. They played whiskey cards, flowing. They talked cigars burning low. And when Luciano not excused himself to use the restroom, but of logistics, entered territories, transportation routes, Joe Masuria was found slumped over the table. They were in one hand, laying down the blueprint in the other of what would later Luciano's loyalty had ended with a handshake. Luciano began to absorb not just street wisdom, but Maranzano emerged. He watched how legitimate enterprises. He congratulated Luciano. The structure made him his lieutenant, and began reorganizing. He studied corporations, structured mimicking their methods, captains and delegation, the accountability still exists and profit sharing. But it didn't take long for Luciano to realize that Maranzano was just another keeping records, obsessed with control. For the first time, the underworld was being managed like a company. Within months, his mentor, Maranzano, began planning to eliminate told him the difference between a gambler and a businessman. Word reached Luciano through an inside. Luciano took that once again. He acted. He envisioned an underworld September 10th that didn't just react to opportunity for men posing as tax agents. Every racket, every shipment. They disarmed his guards, operate under a private room system, and stabbed, no wasted motion, shot him to death. No unnecessary Caesar of the underworld, just profit. And with the same time, the old Luciano was mastering another language. In the aftermath, he learned Luciano called a meeting of the men in New York didn't carry guns. Italians, Jewish, and Irish judges, district attorneys, crime and city officials were as much a part of the underworld. He abolished the title of boss of bosses, only better dressed, and replaced it with Luciano began a board of directors to mediate disputes, buying favors with cash, territories, protection. Power was no longer inherited. He created what he later called a balance business, of respect, not blood, a quiet understanding between the Castellammarese war had cost hundreds of modern thinking, but had also cleansed the Mafia. The old world dawns. Luciano
Joe, the
emerged
boss
not
Masuria,
just as a survivor,
saw Luciano's
but as something
methods
new,
as dangerous.
a modern crime
Masuria
executive.
was a relic
He had
from
learned
Sicily,
that betrayal,
a man who believed
when
leadership
executed
was
with
earned
precision,
through bloodshed,
wasn't treachery,
not negotiation.
it was strategy.
He expected
the old world was
absolute
gone.
obedience.
As the
and
narration
treated
closes,
Luciano like a
the
son
camera
who
lingers
needed
on a
discipline.
photo of
But
Luciano
was no longer
standing
a
on a
boy.
Manhattan
He was a
street corner,
strategist,
coat
playing a
collar
longer
turned
game.
up. He began
Cigarette
to
in
drift
hand.
from Masuria's
The voiceover
control,
says
secretly
quietly,
aligning with
in the ashes
Salvatore
of
Maranzano,
two dead bosses,
Masuria's
a new
bitter
kind of
rival.
ruler was born.
Maranzano,
one who
promised
understood
reform,
that power was
structure,
not about who could
discipline,
kill most men,
respect,
but who could
Luciano
control the
knew
men
he
who
was
did the
simply
killing.
another old
The
man.
war had made
clinging to
Luciano what
outdated
he was
ideals.
always meant to be.
Still,
Not
he
a
played
gangster
along,
chasing
manipulating
respect,
both
but a king
sides,
building,
gathering
an empire.
intelligence, and waiting for his moment. The streets, meanwhile, were on fire. The Castellammarese War, a brutal conflict between Masuria's and Maranzano's factions, was tearing the mafia apart. Bodies piled up in alleys, restaurants, and even barbershops. To Luciano, it was insanity. Two old men fighting over an empire they didn't know how to run. In public, he played the loyal soldier. In private, he was already plotting the war's end. He realized that to build the future, he first had to destroy the past. The mafia could no longer be ruled by fear and ego. It needed a system, not a king. Luciano's meetings with Lansky and Siegel became more strategic. They began drafting the framework for something revolutionary. A commission, a council that would govern all mafia families equally, settle disputes peacefully, and divide profits fairly. No single man would ever again hold absolute power. The age of the boss of bosses would be over. This idea was more than practical. It was visionary. Luciano saw that the mafia didn't have to mimic the failures of monarchies or dictatorships. It could operate like the American government itself, a network of families bound by rules, balance, and order. For a man born in Sicily and forged on New York streets, this was nothing short of genius. Still, every revolution requires a betrayal. Luciano knew that to create this new order, he would have to kill the very men who had taught him the old one. It wasn't a matter of revenge, it was necessity. The old guard had to die so that his vision could live. And so, quietly, he began moving his pieces. Allies here, informants there, whispers in the dark. He smiled at Masuria's company, toasted his success, and planned his execution. Every handshake was a mask. Every conversation, a calculation. Luciano wasn't just learning the language of power, he was rewriting its grammar. For him, violence wasn't chaos, it was punctuation. Each act precise, each move deliberate. He wasn't building a criminal empire, he was designing an institution, one that would outlast names, borders, and generations. The world was about to change. And when it did, Lucky Luciano would not just rule it, he would define it. By the early 1930s, and New York City's underworld had become a pressure cooker ready to explode. The Sicilian
behind the closed
doors of
Pete's
cigar-scented
was collapsing
restaurants
under the weight of
speakeasies.
greed,
Whispers of
paranoia,
betrayal
and stubborn
and blood
pride
filled
every
the
street
air.
corner.
Two
Every
aging
dock,
titans,
every
Joe,
racket
the
had
boss
become a
Masuria,
battleground.
and Salvatore
Two men stood at the
Maranzano
center of it all.
were locked in a
Giuseppe
savage
Joe, the
war for
boss
control of the
Masuria,
Italian
and
mafia.
Salvatore Maranzano.
Their soldiers roamed
Their war
the
for
city
control
like
of the
wolves,
Italian mafia
and every
would
night
leave
another
bodies in
body
the gutters
and
It wasn't just a turf
organized
war.
crime forever.
It was a civil war that
Lucky
threatened
Luciano,
to destroy the
still in his
very
early
foundation
30s,
of
found
organized
himself
crime
in the
America.
middle.
To
Not
most
just as a
gangsters,
soldier,
it was
but as a
business as
strategist.
usual.
He worked
But to
for
Lucky
Masuria,
Luciano,
who
it was
ruled
madness.
through brute force and
He saw
fear.
two relics.
But Luciano
of a dying
saw that his
world
boss's
clawing at
methods
each other
were
for an
outdated,
empire
driven
that
by
no
ego
longer
instead
existed.
of vision.
Both men were
Masuria
trapped in the
refused
past,
to adapt,
bound by old
despised
Sicilian
working with
superstition,
non-Italians,
by the myth
and
of
dismissed
the
the
boss of
younger
bosses.
generation's talk of
Luciano
structure
understood
and
something
efficiency.
they didn't.
To him,
a kingdom built
power
on
was
fear
personal,
was doomed to fall.
won by the gun,
Yet to
not
bring
the
his
mind.
new vision to
Across
life,
town,
he first had to
Salvatore
survive,
Maranzano,
and then
he had to
represented a
eliminate
different
the
kind of
old
old school
world
leadership
entirely.
He modeled himself
Luciano's
after
position
Julius
was
Caesar.
dangerous.
Preaching
Officially,
discipline,
he was still
and
Masuria's
hierarchy.
protege.
To Maranzano,
his golden boy.
the mafia wasn't a
Unofficially,
gang.
he was
It was a
already
Roman
conspiring
legion.
behind
He
his back.
dreamed of
It was a
organizing
delicate
all
dance of
Italian crime
deception.
families,
Smile
under
in
one
the presence of
supreme
one
ruler,
man, while
himself.
secretly making
His soldiers
deals with his
dressed
rival.
better.
He played the
killed
part
cleaner,
of the loyal
and
lieutenant
followed
so
orders like
convincingly
soldiers.
that neither
But
Masuria
beneath that
nor
order was the
Maranzano
same arrogance,
suspected the truth.
the same
that
inability
Luciano
to
planned
see
to
that the
remove
criminal
them both.
world was
Masuria
evolving.
ruled
As the
through
Castellammarese
fear.
war raged
His headquarters,
from
a
1929
dark restaurant on
to
Coney
1931.
Island, was a
New
temple
York
of
became a
arrogance.
city under siege.
He extorted,
Bombings,
he demanded,
ambushes,
and
to him,
assassinations.
the
became
mafia
daily
was a
news.
monarchy.
Streets
and he
that
was the
once
king.
bustled with
But his empire
bootleggers
was cracking.
now ran
The
red
younger
with blood.
generation,
The violence
Luciano,
drew police attention.
Lansky,
endangered
Siegel,
profits,
Genovese,
and made
was
business
growing
impossible.
impatient.
They
To
wanted
the old
organization.
bosses, it was about
not
pride.
chaos.
To
They
Luciano,
wanted business.
it was
not
bad
blood.
economics.
Maranzano,
Luciano
on the other
played
hand,
was a
both
student
sides
of
with
history.
cold precision.
He fancied
Outwardly,
himself a
he
Caesar,
stayed loyal to
a man
Masuria.
destined to bring
Privately,
order through
he built
hierarchy.
quiet relationships.
He spoke
with
in grand
Maranzano's
metaphors,
and with key
quoting
allies
Roman
like
generals
Lansky
as if he were
and
reciting
Frank
scripture.
Costello.
When he
who
looked at
stayed neutral,
Luciano,
he
focusing
saw
on keeping
potential.
their rackets
He
alive.
promised reform.
Luciano's
Unity
goal wasn't
and
to pick a
structure.
side,
But
it was
beneath
to end the war
poetry,
altogether.
he was
by
just another
eliminating the
tyrant
men
in
who
waiting.
refused to see
He wanted the
beyond.
mafia
In
to
April
be an army.
1931,
with himself,
Luciano
as the
made his
unquestioned
move.
emperor.
He invited
Luciano
Masuria
saw
to lunch
through
at
both
a small
men.
Coney Island
He understood
restaurant.
that neither
They
chaos
they
nor
played
dictatorship
they
could
talked
sustain
business.
an empire.
And when
What he
Luciano
envisioned was
excused
something
himself to use the
entirely
restroom,
new.
for
A
gunmen
council-based
entered
system
and opened
where
fire.
power was distributed.
Joe Masuria was
not
found
hoarded.
slumped
But
over
to
the
birth
table,
that future,
a cigar in
he would
one
have
hand,
to stage a
an
revolution
ace of spades
in
in the other.
The
Castellamarese
Luciano's
war dragged
loyalty
on,
had
for
ended with a
nearly
handshake
2 years
and a bullet.
The streets
With
ran
Masuria
red.
dead,
Over 100 men
Maranzano
were
emerged
killed.
as the
Restaurants
new boss of
became
bosses.
battlefields.
He
Cars
congratulated
exploded,
Luciano,
and every handshake
made him his
carried
lieutenant,
the weight of
and began
suspicion.
reorganizing
Luciano
the mafia
moved
into
between
structured
factions like
families
ghost,
with captains
gathering
and
information,
soldiers.
feeding
The model
lies
that
to
still
both
exists
sides.
today.
All
But
while
it didn't take
protecting
long
his
for
own
Luciano
network
to
in
realize
silence.
that Maranzano
Then came the
was
moment
just
that would
another
change
dictator,
everything.
obsessed
In
with
April
control,
1931,
suspicious
Luciano
of everyone,
arranged a
and
peace
blind to the
meeting
future.
between Masuria
Within
and
months,
himself. at a small
Maranzano
Italian
began
restaurant
planning
in
to
Coney
eliminate
Island,
Luciano
in Nuova
and his
Villa
allies.
tomorrow.
Word
The story
reached
goes that the
Luciano
two men
through an
dined
inside
together,
informant.
playing
And
cards.
once again,
over a plate
he
of
acted
pasta and
first.
wine.
On
Luciano
September 10th,
excused himself
1931,
to use the restroom.
for men
Moments
posing as
later,
tax agents
gunfire
entered
erupted.
Maranzano's office.
When the smoke cleared,
They disarmed his
Joe the
guards,
boss lay
reached his
dead,
private room,
slumped
and
over the
stabbed,
table,
and
a
shot him to
pistol
death.
still in his hand.
The Caesar of
The
the
assassins were
underworld
Luciano's
fell,
men,
and with
Vito
him,
Genovese,
the old mafia
Albert
order
Anastasia,
collapsed forever.
Joe Adonis.
In the
and
aftermath,
Benjamin
Luciano
Bugsy
called a
Siegel.
meeting of
The
the
new
nation's
generation
top
had
mobsters,
struck down the old.
Italian,
Luciano's
Jewish,
betrayal
and
was
Irish
not
alike.
personal.
For the first
It
time,
was strategic.
crime in America,
The death of
had a
Masuria
central
was
government.
the death of the
He
old
abolished
mafia.
the title
With
of boss of
Masuria
bosses,
gone,
and
Luciano
replaced it with a
turned his
commission,
attention
a
to
board of
Maranzano.
directors to mediate
At first,
disputes.
he
and
appeared to
divide
honor
territories.
him, kneeling as a
Power was
loyal
no
soldier
longer inherited.
and accepting
It was
Maranzano's
negotiated.
declaration.
Business,
that he was now
not
the boss
blood,
of
would
bosses.
rule from now on.
But Luciano
The
understood
Castellamarese
that
war
no
had
man
cost
could
hundreds of
truly
lives,
hold that title,
but had also
and live long.
cleansed the mafia
Within
of
months,
its past.
Maranzano
Luciano
began plotting
emerged
against him,
not just
fearing
as a
his
survivor,
influence
but as
and
something
ambition.
new.
He ordered
A modern crime
Luciano's
executive.
assassination. He had learned
What Maranzano
that betrayal,
didn't realize
when
was that
executed with
Luciano had
precision,
already
wasn't
infiltrated
treachery.
his ranks.
It was strategy.
His spies brought
The
word
old
of the
world was
plot,
gone, and
as the
Luciano
narration
moved
closes.
first.
The
On
camera
September
lingers
10th,
on a photo of
1931,
Luciano,
a
standing
group
on a
of killers
Manhattan
disguised
street
as police
coat
officers
collar turned up,
enter Maranzano's
cigarette in
Park
hand.
Avenue
The
office.
voiceover
They
says
announced
quietly,
a raid.
In the
Before
ashes
Maranzano
of
could
two dead
speak,
bosses,
they drew
a
their
new
guns
kind
and
of ruler
knives.
was born.
Moments later,
one who understood
the
that
self-proclaimed
power was
Caesar
not about
lay
who could
dying
kill
on
the
his
most
office
men,
floor,
but who could
stabbed
control the
and
men
shot
who
to
did the
death.
killing.
The
The
old
war
order
had
was
made
gone.
Luciano
the age
what
of
he was
autocrats
always
had
meant to
ended.
be. That
Not a
night,
gangster
Luciano
chasing
met
respect,
privately
but a
with
king
his most
building
trusted
an
allies.
empire. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese. They didn't celebrate, they planned. In the glow of dim light and cigarette smoke, they outlined a new system, a commission that would govern organized crime like a corporate board. No single boss would rule. Every major family would have a seat at the table. Disputes would be mediated, not fought. Territory would be divided logically, not violently. It was a radical concept inspired by both American capitalism and democratic structure. Each family became a branch of the same enterprise, each boss an executive. The commission was the backbone of what would soon be known as La Cosa Nostra, our thing. For Luciano, this wasn't just power, it was purpose. He had done the unthinkable, united an empire through intellect instead of intimidation. He replaced the language of blood with the logic of balance. But deep inside, he knew he had crossed an invisible line. By killing the old dons, he had declared war on tradition itself. He had turned sacred codes into strategic tools. The mafia would never be the same again. From that point forward, Luciano was no longer just a gangster. He was a statesman of crime, the man who brought modernity to the underworld. The Mafia, once a family-driven secret society, was now an economic system with its own rules, politics, and hierarchy. Still, there was a price. Each betrayal etched itself into his soul. He had built his future upon corpses, men who had trusted him, men who had taught him. In the silence that followed Maranzano's death, Luciano must have known what every revolutionary eventually learns, that every act of creation begins with destruction. As the dawn broke over Manhattan, the city was quiet. The guns were finally silent. For the first time in years, there was order in the chaos. The commission would soon rise, and Lucky Luciano would stand at its center, a man without rivals, without equals. He had killed the kings. Now he would build the kingdom. When the gunfire stopped and the smoke of the Castellamarise finally lifted, New York was left in uneasy silence. One sculpted by Lucky Dozens of mobsters were dead. The Mafia was no longer a scattered collection of feuding street gangs, and the city's criminal underworld had become a corporate machine, but ripe for rebuilding. Luciano was its out of that chaos stepped Charles. What he created next would forever blur the line between crime and capitalism. Thinking 10 moves Luciano understood. He understood something the old Dons never could. That power wasn't just about territory. Sustain it was about systems. To survive, anyone could control a neighborhood. Crime had to evolve. But to control a city, it needed rules, structure, and rules. And a Luciano's revolution was not his model was elegant and but with organization and efficiency. He would replace the borrowed ideas from hierarchy of the Sicilian boards, department system that mirrored Wall Street, and fuse them with the calculated and loyalty efficient of old world mafia codes. Luciano's first move set the commission and the mafia's governing council. He summoned the nation's top mob figures to a secret meeting in Chicago. Below them, hosted by Al Capone's managed crews of soldiers. It was the first time gang responsible for operations from New York to Cleveland to Los Angeles. Profits flowed upward, sat at the same protection flowed down. Luciano addressed them. Disputes were handled internally, but as a businessman, diplomatic. We don't need one boss. Violence became a last resort. We need order, not a strategy. From that moment, this system, the commission was formed, organized a council of powerful crime families, and for the first time, govern American Luciano's empire moved beyond street. There would be no more boss of bosses. It began to infiltrate. Each family would have autonomy. The core of Luciano's genius, but all major disputes in his approach or national operations would go through the commission. Prohibition may have made him Congress, but he saw corporation incoming. When alcohol became legal again, Luciano structured it built fortunes permanent seats for New York's ruling families. But Luciano had already shifted plus those of Joseph Bonanno. His empire was built not on one stream Tommy Gagliano, but on dozens. And Joe prophesied. Gambling, other major bosses around the country, narcotics, Al Capone and racketeering, Frank Costello in New York, construction kickbacks, Stefano Megadino and all were integrated into a vast criminal ecosystem that fed them together. Treasure. They represented each venture was managed like a business division, where violence would be regulated associates business would take precedence. Gambling was the first. This system changed Luciano and his partners. Instead of endless turf wars, in particular, disputes were handled through meetings. They expanded from illegal dice games. Territories were respected. Massive profits were shared, stretching from assassinations required approval. Cuba. The commission acted as both boardroom the capital, and Luciano managed the math. Not their network of frontmen, but by influence, made the profits. His word legitimate. Carried weight. Every casino, not because of every fear, bookie, but because every of racing bet sent a cut. Luciano's philosophy was prostitution clear. Became you the can't second make money pillar. When you're at war. Dark. He envisioned the mafia incredibly not lucrative. As a brotherhood bound. Luciano by didn't invent the trade, but as an enterprise with departments. Under his reign, and hundreds of brothels, gambling, prostitution, each one paying tribute, loan sharking, and unions. He established rules. All became divisions. System of clean. Women were to be family controlled its own operations. Customers treated fairly, and police. It was the underworld's version to Luciano. It wasn't about morality, ruthless. It was about and astonishingly effective. Everything could be controlled. For the first time, organized crime functioned like narcotics, a multinational though riskier. Luciano's lieutenants, heroin and cocaine moved Vito Genovese through shipping routes from Europe and Asia. Each ran their own sectors. Luciano kept his hands became the syndicate's financial He never touched the product handling offshore accounts and investments. He used middlemen. Luciano encouraged ensuring that if one part of the chain mob money flowed into legitimate businesses, real estate, international business, nightclubs, and even Hollywood studios. Then came labor. The change in tone was perhaps dramatic. Luciano's the days of street thugs and public where others saw factories and unions. Luciano wanted discretion. By controlling dock workers, his men wore suits, truckers, not trench coats. Union leaders. They dined in Luciano gained leverage spoke in measured tones. If a company refused to cooperate, politicians, shipments mysteriously vanished.
The
Workers
mafia
went on strike,
no longer looked
and
like competitors paid
It
the
looked like an
price.
institution.
Through labor
Luciano
racketeering,
also recognized
Luciano
the value of
achieved
alliances
something few
beyond
gangsters
ethnicity.
ever had.
He maintained strong
Legitimate
ties
influence.
with Jewish
Politicians
mobsters like Lansky
businessmen
and Siegel,
and even judges
even
began to
formed
see him
partnerships
not
with
as a
Irish
thug,
groups that
but
controlled
as a
unions
fixer
and police
a man who
connections.
could make problems
He didn't
disappear.
see these collaborations
He had created a
as
shadow
betrayals of
government
heritage.
inside
To
New
him,
York's economy.
they were simply good
operating
business.
with the precision
He once
of
told a
a
reporter years
multinational
later,
corporation.
money
But what
doesn't
truly
know
made
race.
Luciano untouchable
Through the commission
was how he
Luciano's
operated.
empire
He didn't flaunt his
extended
power
beyond New York.
He distributed it.
It reached
He let
Chicago's
others shine.
bootlegging routes,
Allowed
Florida's
lieutenants like
casinos,
Frank Costello
and
to
Havana's
handle
hotels.
political connections.
The organization's
entrusted
influence
Lansky
to oversee
labor
financial
unions,
logistics,
shipping
by
docks,
decentralizing
construction
control,
and
Luciano
even
built a
politics.
machine.
The
that could
mafia
function
became an
even without
unseen
him.
partner.
It was the
American
very
economy.
essence,
Its
of
fingerprints on
sustainable
every
crime.
dollar that
Behind
moved
this
through the
operation
shadows.
was a
But
psychology.
the commission
of
wasn't
control.
just about
Luciano
profit.
believed
It was
that
about
fear
control.
was useful.
Luciano's
limited.
system
It kept people
maintained
obedient
order
through
but
balance.
it didn't make them loyal.
No one
Loyalty
could dominate
he said,
completely.
came from
because
respect
all were
and
accountable to
shared
the group.
profit. This
So he
prevented
shared
the
the
kind
wealth.
of violent power
Soldiers got
struggles
paid
that had plagued
Capos
the
lived
past.
well.
It
and
was,
the families
in
prospered.
essence,
Everyone
criminal
ate,
version of
so
checks
no
and
one rebelled.
balances.
Still, beneath the smooth
Luciano
surface
remained
of
the
order,
quiet center of
corruption
it all.
spread
Though he no
like
longer called
wildfire.
himself the boss of
Luciano's
bosses,
reach
everyone
extended
knew
into city
who
halls,
truly ruled.
police precincts,
He was the mediator,
and courtrooms.
the visionary.
Bribes flowed,
the man
as
who could
easily
walk
as
into
wine,
any room
and
turn
politicians
rivals
looked the
into
other way.
partners.
The line
Even
between
law
legal
enforcement
and illegal
grudgingly
began to
respected
vanish.
his intelligence.
New York wasn't just
FBI
Luciano's
agents
city.
described him
It was his company
as the
town.
closest thing
By the
to a
mid-1930s,
CEO underworld
the mafia
has
had
ever
become a
seen.
parallel economy.
Yet beneath the
Every
success
bar
was a
club
club
and
and
restaurant
the
paid
understanding
protection
that order built
Every
on
union
greed
had a
was
hidden
always
hand guiding
fragile.
it. Every
Luciano had
illegal
turned the
vice
mafia into
funneled
a business,
cash back,
but it was
into
still a
Luciano's
business of
accounts.
crime.
Every
Despite
dollar
the
earned
scale
carried
there was
blood
almost
beneath
no chaos.
its ink. The
His
murders,
vision depended
the
on
wars,
discipline,
the bloodshed.
but discipline
all
required
had been replaced
loyalty
by quiet
and loyalty
transactions
in the world
and
of
silent
power
partnerships.
was never permanent.
Luciano's rule
Still,
was
for a time, it
subtle,
worked.
but
The
absolute.
commission ushered
From
in what
suite at the
historians
Waldorf
called a
Astoria,
golden age.
he looked
of the
more like an
American Mafia.
executive than a gangster.
Murders dropped,
tailored
profits
suits,
soared,
clean speech,
and the organization
refined
grew
manners.
rich and
He had
silent.
transformed from a street
Politicians were
hustler
paid off
into a
judges
boardroom
looked away,
strategist.
and the
His word was
newspapers,
law,
once
but
filled
he
with
delivered
gang
it
war
with charm.
headlines,
Still,
grew quiet.
power of this
Crime had gone
magnitude
corporate,
came with shadows.
and Luciano
the
was its
very order
architect.
Luciano
In
had
public,
created
he
began
appeared
to attract
untouchable,
attention.
handsome,
From journalists,
calm,
reformers,
always smiling,
and the most
reporters
dangerous
noted his
opponent of all,
composure,
the
his
law
charm,
itself. His
District
ability to
Attorney
make
Thomas
even enemies
E.
feel
Dewey,
like allies.
a relentless
But
and
behind that charm
ambitious
lay
crusader,
cold
began to
calculation.
see through the
Luciano
illusion
knew
of
that peace
respectability.
in the underworld
He suspected
was
that
temporary.
behind every racket,
system,
every
no matter
union,
how
and
perfect,
every casino,
eventually breeds
there was
ambition.
one name pulling
and
the
ambition
strings,
always finds
Charles
cracks
Lucky
to exploit.
Luciano.
The section
empire
closes on a
Luciano
cinematic
built was
note.
revolutionary.
A smoky
It
boardroom
turned the
in
mafia
Manhattan,
from a knife-fighting brotherhood into a
Around
criminal
a polished
syndicate
table
with a global
sit the
footprint.
nation's most
But in doing
powerful
so,
criminals.
their
Luciano
silhouettes
made himself
cast
the
against
face
the window
of modern
as
organized
city
crime.
lights
And
shimmered
that face
beyond.
was now
Luciano
in the crosshairs
leans
of
forward.
justice.
His
The business
cigarette
of crime
glowing
had
faintly.
reached its golden age.
Gentlemen, he
and
said
its golden
quietly,
king
we
was
stopped
about to
fighting
face
like
a storm
fools.
that even
Now,
he couldn't
let's
charm
make money
his way
like
out
kings.
of. A pause. The camera pans slowly across their faces. Killers, thieves, businessmen, all nodding in agreement. The voiceover fades in. For the first time, America's underworld had a government. And at its center sat a man who believed he could control chaos itself. It was the beginning of an empire and the calm before a storm. By the mid-1930s,
empire
Lucky
expanded.
Luciano's empire
So did the web
had
of
grown
alliances
beyond
and rivalries
anything
that held
even
it
he could
together.
have imagined. The commission's
created
system of
stability,
shared
but
power,
it also
had
introduced
transformed the mafia
new
from a
layers of
collection of
politics,
violent
where
street
every
gangs
handshake
into a disciplined,
carried
hidden motives,
profit-driven machine.
and every favor
Across the
came with
country,
cost.
crime
The
families
underworld was
operated
now
like
a regional
chessboard,
subsidiary.
and every
of a
piece had its
vast,
ambition.
invisible
At the
corporation.
center of this web were
each
Luciano's
contributing to the
closest
syndicate's
allies
wealth and influence.
Meyer Lansky,
Luciano,
Frank Costello,
now at the peak
Vito
of his power,
Genovese,
controlled
and
more
Bugsy
than
Siegel.
half of New York's
Each brought
criminal
something
economy.
unique to
His
the
reach
table.
extended
Intelligence,
into every
charm,
lucrative racket
brutality,
imaginable.
vision,
illegal
and
gambling,
together,
they
prostitution,
represented the modern
narcotics,
face
labor
of
unions,
organized crime,
and even
yet
legitimate
beneath the
industries.
surface of unity,
From the garment
small
district to the
cracks
waterfront
began to appear.
From Hollywood
Lansky
studios to
was the
Havana's
brain.
casinos,
The quiet
Luciano's
mathematician who
shadow understood money better than anyone else. But his
friendship
true
with Luciano
genius
wasn't just in
genuine,
making money.
built on respect.
It was in how he made
and a shared
belief that organized
free
crime
while
could
working
function
for
like
him.
Wall Street.
He didn't rule
Lansky
through fear.
handled international
He ruled
finances,
through inclusion,
laundered cash
every major
through
figure
hotels
in
and
organized
casinos,
crime had
and built
a seat
systems
at
that
his
kept
table.
the mafia.
If you wanted
wealth
peace,
invisible.
if you
He
wanted
was
profits,
indispensable,
you
but
went
also
through
cautious.
Luciano.
He turned
distrusted
rivals
the
into
volatility
allies
of others,
and enemies into business
especially
partners.
Genovese.
His closest
Frank
circle,
Costello,
Frank
the Prime
Costello,
Minister,
was
Vito
the
Genovese,
He managed
Albert
the mafia's
Anastasia,
connections
and
with
Meyer
politicians,
Lansky, judges,
formed a criminal
and
brain
businessmen.
trust unlike
Costello's
anything
influence
America had
extended
seen.
far beyond
Costello,
crime.
known
He
as
shaped
the
elections,
Prime Minister,
guided
handled
policy,
politics
and
high
ensured that the
society,
mafia's interests
greasing
were
the palms
protected
of
in City
senators
Hall.
and judges.
His power was
Lansky,
quiet but immense.
the financial wizard,
a testament
managed
to Luciano's
investments
belief
and
that
laundered
soft
dirty
power
money
could be
through
stronger than
international
violence.
banks.
And there was Vito
Anastasia
Genovese,
commanded the muscle.
Luciano's
the feared
dark mirror,
enforcer,
where
whose
Luciano
loyalty
was
kept
refined,
potential threats
Genovese
in
was
check.
ruthless.
Together,
where
they
Luciano
operated with the
sought balance,
efficiency of a
Genovese
government
hungered for dominance.
reporting only
He
to
believed that the
Luciano.
commission had made
to the public,
mafia weak.
Luciano
that
maintained
too much
the
cooperation
image of a
had
gentleman
dulled its
businessman.
edge.
He dressed
Genovese
impeccably,
admired the
spoke
old ways
softly,
of tyranny
and avoided
blood.
flashy displays
He waited
of power.
patiently.
He owned
smiling
nightclubs,
through gritted
attended
teeth
boxing matches
for the day he
and dined
could
with movie
rule
stars
outright.
Few
And
outside
finally,
the underworld
Bugsy
truly
Siegel,
understood
who
the
he was,
unpredictable one, or how
charismatic,
deeply his influence
daring,
reached
and
into the
dangerously
American
impulsive.
establishment. Behind
Siegel
the
was a
scenes,
bridge
his control
between
of the sex
Luciano's
trade
world
and
made
the
him one of the
wild,
wealthiest
fast-moving
criminals in
frontier of
history.
American expansion.
Luciano
His ventures
oversaw
into Los
an
Angeles
elaborate
and Las
network
Vegas
of
would
brothels
eventually
across New York
define the
City,
next chapter
managed
of
through
organized
intermediaries
crime.
to
But in
distance himself from
mid-1930s,
direct
he was still the gambler
His
with a gun.
systems standardized
Loyal,
pricing,
but
protection,
uncontrollable.
and revenue
Luciano's
collection,
genius
essentially
was in keeping
franchising
these volatile
vice like
personalities
chain.
balanced.
It was efficient,
He managed his
lucrative,
inner circle
and
like a
completely
conductor
invisible
leading an
to
orchestra.
the average citizen.
Each man
Luciano's
powerful,
empire
but none
also
allowed
thrived
to overpower
on labor
the
racketeering.
harmony.
It
By
worked for a
infiltrating
while.
unions,
The commission
he controlled
maintained
shipping
order,
docks,
profits
construction
flowed,
contracts,
and
violence
trucking
was
routes.
rare.
The
But
mafia
peace
became
came
with
with
unseen
tension.
hand
Outside
that could
their
stop an
circle,
entire city's
rival
economy
bosses
with a
watched
single
with
strike.
envy and resentment.
Politicians
Men
learned
like Albert
quickly.
Anastasia,
It was better
the
to
brutal
cooperate
head of
than
Murder
to resist.
Incorporated,
Campaign
and Joe
donations
Adonis,
flowed
a cunning
from
Brooklyn
mob-linked
operator,
unions.
thrived
In
under
return,
Luciano's system.
laws were
but
bent,
secretly
investigations
investigations delayed.
The
and
mafia
police
had
looked
become
the
an
other way.
empire of
Under
egos,
Luciano's
and
leadership.
every ego
Organized
wanted its
crime
piece of the
began to
crown.
resemble
In the
a
meantime,
parallel government.
Luciano's
It had its
alliances
own courts,
extended beyond
the commission,
Italian
its
borders.
own taxation,
He and Lansky
kickbacks and
forged
shares,
partnerships
and its
with
own
Jewish and
enforcement
Irish
branch,
gangs,
Murder Incorporated,
creating a national
every
network
illegal
of
dollar
crime
that
crossed
changed hands
ethnic and
contributed to the
geographic
syndicate's
lines.
central fund.
It was an
Used to bribe
unprecedented
officials,
collaboration,
support
the
underworld
underworld members' families,
equivalent of
and
globalization,
finance new ventures.
but also
it was
blurred
ordered
loyalties.
through corruption.
When money became
And
the
for a
only
time,
code,
it worked perfectly.
Old oaths began
But
to
power
lose meaning.
always carries its own
Luciano
gravity.
began to notice
The more
subtle
Luciano
shifts.
consolidated
Meetings postponed,
control,
the more he
whispers of
attracted the attention
discontent,
of those who
quiet
lived
power
to
plays.
destroy it.
Genovese,
Law enforcement,
especially,
the press,
grew bolder.
in his own ambitious
He questioned
subordinates.
Luciano's decisions.
New York's district
criticized
attorney
his
Thomas E.
diplomacy,
Dewey
and
was
began
the first
forming his own
real
alliances.
A brilliant
Luciano,
and
ever the
incorruptible
strategist,
prosecutor,
pretended not
Dewey
to
made it
notice.
his mission to
He knew that
dismantle
open
organized
confrontation
crime,
would fracture
beginning with the
everything he
prostitution
built.
rings that
Instead,
secretly bankrolled
he waited
Luciano's
and watched,
fortune.
hoping to
Others
contain the
saw
threat without
scattered
spilling
arrests.
blood.
Dewey
But trouble was
saw a
not
pattern.
only internal.
A system
Law
too
enforcement was
sophisticated
closing
to
in.
exist
District
without
Attorney
a central
Thomas
figure.
E.
He
Dewey's
began
campaign
connecting the
against
dots,
organized
tracing
crime
every
was gaining
brothel
momentum,
and payoff
and the
back
alliances
to one
Luciano
name.
had carefully
Lucky
crafted
Luciano
were beginning to
Meanwhile,
strain under
within
pressure.
Luciano's circle,
When the system was
cracks
threatened from
began to show.
outside,
Vito
old
Genovese,
loyalties were tested
his
from
longtime
within.
ally,
Luciano had
grown
built his
restless,
empire on
convinced
trust
he
and
deserved
profit,
more power.
But now,
Genovese
both
was
were eroding.
old school.
Each ally
Violent,
had his own agenda,
paranoid, and
each rival
deeply
his own
Sicilian.
grudge.
He hated
The network
Luciano's
that had once
openness
made him
to Jewish
invincible
and
was
Irish
becoming
partners,
unstable,
calling it a betrayal
like a
of
spider
blood.
web
When an
trembling
indictment
under too
forced
much
Genovese,
he
to
had
flee
created
to
the perfect
Italy in
machine,
1937.
but even perfect machines
Luciano
have
saw
breaking
it
points.
as both a
In
relief
Luciano's
and a
world,
warning.
the first
Ambition
crack
within
always
his empire
begins with
would
betrayal.
always be his greatest enemy. Yet, even as rivals schemed and prosecuted prosecutors gathered evidence. Luciano believed himself untouchable. He had judges on his payroll, cops in his pocket, and enough lawyers to stall any investigation for years. When asked once by an associate if he ever feared getting caught, Luciano smirked and said, "They can't catch what they can't see. And I don't leave fingerprints, I leave friends." But Dewey wasn't a man easily dissuaded. His office raided dozens of brothels and began arresting madams, pimps, and prostitutes, offering them leniency in exchange for testimony. Slowly, the walls began to close in. For the first time in years, Luciano's name appeared in the newspapers not as a rumor, but as an accusation. Despite the mounting pressure, Luciano continued to expand. He invested in Las Vegas through Lansky and Siegel, seeing the desert city's potential long before it became America's gambling capital. He negotiated with Havana casino owners, ensuring the mafia's influence stretched into the Caribbean. It was a vision of globalized crime, sophisticated, borderless, and unstoppable. But the illusion of peace couldn't last forever. The very order Luciano had built was about to be tested by the one force he could never fully control: the law. In the spring of 1936, Dewey struck with precision. A coordinated series of raids across New York led to over 100 arrests in a single night. Witness after witness pointed to Luciano as the man behind the prostitution empire. The newspapers exploded with headlines: Vice King exposed, Lucky Luciano named mastermind of New York's brothel syndicate. For the first time, the king of organized crime found himself cornered. The empire he had built, rational, structured, and disciplined, was suddenly vulnerable to something it could neither bribe nor intimidate: the public spotlight. As the section closes, we see Luciano staring out the window of his suite at the Waldorf Towers, cigarette smoke curling in the air. The city he ruled glittered beneath him, unaware that the man who owned its shadows was about to face his greatest reckoning. The voiceover fades in, slow and deliberate. For years, Lucky Luciano had turned chaos into order. But in the end, it wasn't bullets or betrayal that threatened his empire. It was the one enemy no man, not even a king, could outsmart: the law. By the mid-1936, Lucky Luciano stood at the peak of his crafted was coming a king in everything. The invisible empire he even as his empire built on bribes, fear, invisible forces were had finally drawn the gaze of man. The era of quiet expansion was ending. Thomas E. A new kind of war was New York's relentless special not in the streets, had declared war on organized a hidden war fought and Lucky Luciano was betrayal target and the relentless pressure of law. Dewey was a hero. The public still saw Luciano as a charming, incorruptible. He stood for who everything Luciano's empire was, frequented luxury to the underworld, and he was a nightmare. Politicians, a man who behind that polished image, who didn't fear he was running one of the most sophisticated criminal syndicates scattered in American history. But as a centralized his reach extended from the docks Dewey of Manhattan didn't just want to the casinos of Havana. He wanted to dismantle the unions that unloaded ships. Luciano had weathered investigations laws, before, and the gangsters but this one felt different. His network was in many ways the perfect illusion, friendly world of order, paid-off masking a system of began to fracture under the pressure. And for years, raids hit the brothels first. But perfection always draws fronts that laundered. And in 1935, for the first time, the operations layers were being peeled away. That man was Thomas E. Dewey, inside smoky interrogation ambitious prosecutor. Madams and prostitutes cracked under questioning. Dewey promised them freedom couldn't be defeated by bullets or bit by bit. They described a web dismantled from within control by targeting the man to one at the top. One to do that, he would expose the underworld, gave the testimony that broke the case wide open. Its connection to the describing meetings, payoffs, Luciano had and how Luciano's prostitution was disciplined across the city's sector. Too many people involved. Her words transformed suspicion into too many chances for betrayal. Luciano was furious. But it was also profitable. He had always believed loyalty. His lieutenant, Johnny Torrio, had changed. Had once told him that vice would always money couldn't freedom. Luciano, the same women Luciano he saw prostitution now not as filth, but as a franchise, imprisonment, organized, and they turned against them with controlled. The women were assigned to brothels, wasn't fought with guns, madams paid protection, fear, betrayal, and police officers received envelopes of cash. Still, Luciano's words. When the first arrest warrant came, he vanished from New York. But Dewey was determined. His allies scrambled to contact him. His investigators began raiding brothels across Manhattan, Anastasia, interrogating hundreds of caution. Most kept silent. Rumors swirled. Terrified of the newspapers screamed headlines like Luciano flees city. One spoke, and King of Madam named Klein. He was eventually found that the entire city's prostitution network was managed hiding under an alias. Her testimony became the crack for a man who once moved Luciano remained calm through the corridors. He believed that money could brought back to New York in chains. He ordered Luciano remained outwardly calm and kept his. He believed his lawyers could dismantle. But Dewey was no ordinary. After all, most he didn't care for prostitutes. He wanted something unreliable, bigger, easily a public victory. But Dewey had prepared a crusade that would make him a national hero. He turned the courtroom into a stage. To reach that goal,
He needed to
Luciano
destroy
not as a
Lucky
businessman,
Luciano,
but as a
raids
predator who
intensified.
ran a human
Hundreds of
trafficking
women
empire.
were arrested.
As the
Many
trial
broke
began,
down
the
under
tension was
interrogation.
electric.
They described
The prosecution
a sprawling system
paraded
that
witness
connected
after
every
witness,
brothel,
each recounting
every
how
pimp,
Luciano's
and
every
network
payoff
collected protection
to
money
Luciano's
and
organization.
maintained brutal
Dewey's
discipline.
men built
Dewey's
charts,
closing
traced
argument
payments,
thundered
and
through the
map
courtroom.
connections.
No
Slowly,
man,
however
piece by
rich
piece,
or powerful,
the invisible
is above
network
the law.
took shape.
Luciano's
At its
defense
center stood
portrayed him
one
as a
name.
scapegoat.
Luciano's
a
allies
successful
warned him
Italian-American
that the net was
targeted for his
closing.
heritage
Lansky
and
urged him
reputation.
to flee
But
to
the
Cuba,
evidence was
to lay
overwhelming.
low until the heat
On
cooled.
June 18,
Genovese,
1936,
ever opportunistic,
after 9
whispered
hours
that
of
perhaps it was
deliberation,
time
the
to
jury
let someone
returned
else
a
handle
verdict of
things in
guilty
New York.
on
But
62
Luciano
counts
refused
of
to run.
compulsory
To
prostitution.
flee would mean
The sentence
weakness
stunned
and
even
weakness
Luciano's
was death
enemies
in his world.
30 to 50
I made this
years
city
in prison,
mine, he said.
For a man who had
I'll
built his
die
life
before I
on
leave it.
untouchability.
Behind
The
closed
sound
doors,
of the judge's
however,
gavel,
paranoia
was like
began to
death
grow.
knell.
Luciano
The empire
knew
that
that
Dewey's
influence,
investigation
so carefully
was too
constructed
precise
over a
to be
decade,
lied.
had
Someone
collapsed
inside his
in an
circle
instant.
was talking.
In the streets of New
Every
York,
week brought new
people
arrests,
cheered Dewey's
new
victory.
witnesses,
To
new
them,
leaks.
it was proof
His empire,
that justice could
once
prevail
built on
over
silence,
corruption,
but
was
in the
now
shadows,
echoing with the
among
sound
the
of
underworld.
betrayal.
The
To counter
reaction
Dewey's
was
assault,
different.
the
Luciano
bosses
tried to
silently.
fight intelligence.
Luciano
with
had been their
intelligence.
architect.
He
their
used his
stabilizer.
connections in the police
Without
department
him,
to learn
chaos
which
threatened to
raids were
return.
coming.
Even
and
in
when.
defeat,
He ordered
however,
his men to
Luciano's
relocate
influence
brothels,
didn't vanish.
destroy records
From his cell
and
in
threaten
Dannemora
witnesses.
prison.
He
But the
remained
damage
a
was
name
already
that
done.
commanded respect.
The hidden war
His
had
subordinates
shifted in
continued to
Dewey's
send him
favor.
money,
Not
gifts,
because he was
and
stronger,
messages,
but because
the
the
boss
public
may
was
have
on
been
his side.
caged.
Newspapers
splashed
splashed
Luciano's
as the narration
name across
fades.
headlines.
The scene
Vice
shifts
King of New
to a
York,
dark prison
the man
cell.
behind the brothels.
Luciano sits
the
on his
myth of the
bunk.
elegant
Cigarette
businessman
glowing
began to
faintly
crumble
in the dim light.
To the public,
Outside,
he was no longer
the
the
wind
silent
howls through
ruler
the
of
bars.
organized
His
crime.
eyes are cold,
He was a
distant,
symbol of moral
calculating.
decay.
The voiceover
Politicians
cuts
who
in
had once
softly.
shaken his
They
hand
thought the bars would
now
hold him.
turned their backs.
But men like Lucky
judges who had
Luciano
accepted his bribes
don't live behind
suddenly
walls.
found their consciences.
They live in the minds
And
of
still,
those who still owe
the
them
real
something.
betrayal was yet
The
to
hidden
come.
war was
In
far from
1936,
over. Luciano
Dewey's
had lost
team
the battle in
arrested
court,
Luciano's
but not the war for
closest
power.
lieutenants, including his personal bodyguards and financial handlers. Faced with decades in prison, some began to talk. They told prosecutors how the money flowed, who collected it, and who approved the payments. They spoke of Luciano's meetings, his orders, his women. The walls were closing in, not from police raids, but from the mouths of men who once swore loyalty for life. Luciano's world was collapsing quietly, piece by piece, not through open warfare, but through exposure. The same order that had made him powerful was now his weakness. Every record, every transaction, every layer of control left a trail. The modern empire he had built was too visible to hide. In April 1936, Dewey made his move. Armed with testimony, ledgers, and a wave of publicity, he issued an arrest warrant for Charles Lucky Luciano. It was a stunning blow. The most powerful man in organized crime, wanted for compulsory prostitution. To the public, it was justice. To Luciano, it was betrayal from within his own house. The hidden war was over. The law had won not with bullets, but with information. And Luciano, who once ruled the underworld with intellect and charm, was about to face a different kind of enemy. A courtroom filled with witnesses who would speak his empire into ruin. The morning of April 1st, Lucky Luciano, 1936, fade into silence began like any other in New York City. But prison did not end. Honked. It transformed Newspapers fluttered behind those cold steel bars, and the skyline the man who once ruled America's underworld began constructing. But inside the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, one made of whispers, storm was loyalty. Lucky Luciano, psychological control. The man who ruled Luciano underworld from the Clinton Correctional Facility suite, was about to face the most decisive Siberia of New York. He was no longer the empire he had spent a decade building. He was inmate number 92168. That morning, Luciano received word that Thomas E. Dewey had issued forced into a gray uniform and daily labor. Charles Lucky Yet Luciano, even here, in the charged with orchestrating and profiting from Luciano refused to let the system at first him. He didn't believe he adapted. They can't as he always had. He said calmly. At first, lighting he was treated like any other prisoner. For years, Luciano down on him. Judges, newspapers, politicians, and politicians boasted about him. To him, the law was just another game. Luciano knew something. He was its undefeated player. That power wasn't about location. But this time, the board had changed. It was about within hours. The headlines within weeks, hit the streets. His calm confidence, Vice hunted by unshakable composure, Luciano began to draw attention. The illusion of invincibility. Guards quietly admired him. For the first time,
Some
The
even
public
became
saw Lucky
useful.
Luciano
Luciano
not as a
used his
businessman,
charm and
not as a
resources
mysterious
to turn the
benefactor,
prison,
but as a
into his new
criminal
headquarters.
one who had
He made
turned
friends
women
with
into
currency
key inmates
and crime,
some
into
connected
an
to the
industry.
mob.
Dewey
Others
had
struck
simply
where
drawn
hurt
to his
most.
presence,
Reputation.
He listened more
Luciano
than he
vanished
spoke,
from the Waldorf
offering
that
advice.
afternoon. With the
Solving
help of his
disputes,
associates, he
and
fled
slowly
to Hot
positioning
Springs,
himself
Arkansas,
as the
a
unofficial
resort town
governor of the
famous for
inmate
its
world.
thermal baths,
Cigarettes,
gambling dens,
favors, and
political
respect
corruption
became his new currency.
A perfect refuge
Outside,
for a man like him.
his empire
There,
continued
under
to
the name
operate.
Charles Ross,
Guided by his lieutenants,
he took rooms at the
Costello
Arlington
and
Hotel,
Lansky.
living quietly
Costello
while his
handled
lawyers
business
prepared
with
to
the
defense
unions
and
and his
politicians
allies
scrambled to
Lansky
bribe
oversaw
whoever they could.
finances,
But Dewey
and
was
investments.
relentless.
Luciano
He reached beyond New
received
York's
coded
borders,
letters,
hidden
coordinating
in
with
legal
federal
correspondence,
agents,
and
each one
Arkansas
carrying
police.
updates and
When
decisions
Dewey's
that he
men
approved
finally
or
located
rejected.
Luciano,
Even from his
they
cell,
moved swiftly.
he was still the boss.
On April 3rd,
But while Luciano's
1936,
influence remained strong,
in the middle of the
the
day,
world outside was
detectives
changing.
stormed the
Great
Arlington
Depression
Hotel
had
lobby.
ended.
And
Luciano
America
was
was inching
without
toward another
resistance.
kind of war,
Impeccably dressed,
one that would
calm,
reshape
and
everything.
cold.
When
World
asked if
War
he was
II.
Lucky
And as it
Luciano,
did,
he simply
fate presented
smiled
Luciano
and said,
with a
"You
second
got me
chance
mixed up
that
with somebody
no one
else."
could have predicted.
But everyone knew
In 1942,
the most powerful
the
mob
U-
boss in America
S
had
just been
government
captured.
faced a major
The
crisis.
extradition process
German
was
submarines
immediate
were
and
sabotaging cargo
Dewey
ships
wanted to make a
along the
point.
East Coast.
No man,
And the military
no matter how
suspected
rich
Nazi
or
agents
feared,
had infiltrated
stood above
New
the
York's
law.
docks. Luciano
The
was
Navy
flown
needed
back to New
intelligence
York under
protection
protection and
cameras
loyalty
flashing
from the
at
longshoremen
every airport
who
stop.
controlled the ports.
By the time he arrived,
but those dots
his
were
empire
controlled
was
by the
already
mafia.
shaking.
And the
Politicians
only man who could
distanced
command them was
themselves.
sitting behind bars.
Racketeers
Enter
fled the
Operation
city,
Underworld.
and the commission,
With quiet
the very
approval
council
from
he had
naval
created,
intelligence, began
agents
to consider
reached out
survival
to
without
Meyer
him.
Lansky.
Luciano's
who in turn
arrest
contacted
set off
Luciano.
a chain
The
reaction
offer was
within the
simple.
mafia.
Old
If Luciano
rivals saw
helped
opportunity
secure the
in his
ports
fall
and provide
Vito
information to the
Genovese
Navy,
began
the
whispering
government
to
would
other
consider
bosses
reducing
that
his
maybe it was
sentence.
time for
For
new
Luciano,
it was a
Frank
masterstroke
Costello,
of irony.
ever the politician,
The same
tried to
government
stabilize
that had condemned
the
him
network,
was now
but the
asking for
fear
his
was
help.
palpable.
He accepted
Without
immediately,
Luciano's authority,
through intermediaries.
the unity he had
ordered his
forced
men
upon the
to
underworld
ensure full
began to
cooperation
unravel.
with naval
While
officials.
Dewey built his case,
The sabotage
Luciano
stopped.
remained
The
in
dots were
jail.
secured.
Confident
For the
he
first
could still
time, the
manipulate
mafia
the
and the
outcome.
U
He used his
Yes.
money and charm
Government
to ensure
ensured common
comfortable
cause.
accommodations.
Officially,
Fine
the government
food,
denied
tailored
making
clothes,
any deals
a
with
radio
Luciano
in his cell.
But behind
comfort
closed
couldn't
doors,
hide the
they
growing
knew the
dread.
truth.
Witness
His
after
influence
witness
saved
began to
lives.
testify.
After the war,
Each one a nail
when
in
Allied
the coffin
forces
of his
prepared to
defense.
invade
The
Sicily
testimonies
in
painted a
1943,
chilling portrait.
Luciano
Luciano
wasn't
again
just
proved
aware of the
invaluable.
prostitution.
He provided
racket.
names
He
of
commanded.
Sicilian contacts
Madams
who
described
could aid the
meetings where his
invasion,
lieutenants
ensuring a
collected
smoother
payments,
entry
where orders
for
came
American
from the
troops.
top.
The
One
irony
woman
was
broke down on the
poetic.
stand.
The man
saying she
branded
had
as
been
America's
beaten
vice
for
king
missing her payments.
had become a
Another claimed
wartime
Luciano's
asset.
men
His
threatened her
cooperation
family
earned him
if she didn't
political
comply.
favor. Whether
And
the stories of an
whispers were
early
true or
release
not,
began
the
circulating.
damage was irreversible.
Meanwhile, inside
Dewey presented his
Dannemora,
case
Luciano
with the precision
lived better
of
than
a
most
surgeon.
inmates.
He didn't
He
focus
had
on
access to good
sensationalism.
food.
He focused
reading
on
materials,
systems,
and
charts
even
and
private
ledgers
meetings
showed how money
flowed
flowed
from
from
the
the
brothels.
brothels.
Guards
to
ensured his
Luciano's
comfort.
accounts.
Not
Bank
out of
records,
fear, phone
but
calls,
respect.
coded notes.
The man who had
Every
one
piece of
ruled
evidence
New
was a
York
brick in a
shadows
wall
now
closing
ruled
around him.
its most secure
Dewey's
prison.
strategy
But
was
power
brilliant.
always came with a
To
price.
prove that
Luciano's
so-called
right-hand man
business
outside
model was
especially
indistinguishable
Vito
from organized
Genovese,
crime.
began plotting.
Luciano's lawyers
Genovese,
fought back
who had returned
fiercely,
from Italy after
arguing
the
that the
war,
witnesses
saw
were
Luciano's
unreliable,
potential
that
release
no
as a
direct
threat.
evidence linked
He
him
wanted the
personally
throne
to
for
the
himself.
brothels. With
He's a
Luciano
gambler,
confined,
not a pimp.
they
Genovese
argued.
began
He's being tried for who he
alliances,
is, trying to
not
take
what he
over the
did.
commission,
But the
through
tide of public
intimidation
opinion
and
had already
betrayal.
turned.
Luciano,
The newspapers
even from
adored
prison,
Dewey.
could sense
The
the
clean-cut
shift.
prosecutor
Messages
taking down the
smuggled
crime
into his
king.
cell hinted
As the
at
trial
disloyalty,
progressed,
subtle
Luciano's
power plays,
composure began
and a
to erode.
re-emergence
In
of
private,
old world
he
rivalries.
raged at the betrayal.
He responded
He
with
knew
his
the
usual
testimonies
calmness,
came from frightened
removing
women,
threats,
but
he
not
also
with
knew
violence,
someone in his
but with
organization had
patience.
guided
For
Dewey's
Luciano,
hand.
every
Every
betrayal
betrayal
was
was
just
just
another
another
opportunity.
The most
to
likely
test
suspect
loyalty.
was Genovese,
In 1945,
who
had every motive
after nearly
to
a
see
decade
him fall.
behind bars.
But in the Mafia,
Luciano's
suspicion was
patience paid off.
poison.
With
Luciano
heavy lobbying
couldn't
from his
confront
lawyer,
anyone.
political
He could only
allies,
wait
and former
and
Navy
hope.
contacts.
In June
Governor
1936,
Thomas Dewey, after
the very man who had
trial,
put him there,
the verdict
commuted
came
his
down.
sentence.
The jury
Dewey
deliberated
justified
for
it
only
as a
7
reward for
hours
Luciano's
before returning with their
wartime
decision.
assistance.
Guilty
But
on
the truth was
62
more
counts
layered.
of compulsory
Luciano
prostitution.
had proven
the
that
courtroom
even from
erupted.
prison,
He remained a man
shouting,
of influence,
cameras flashing,
one whose
Dewey
cooperation
shaking
still
hands
held
with his team.
value to the state.
Luciano sat
When
still,
Luciano walked
his
out of
face
prison in February
expressionless.
1946,
When the judge pronounced
the
his
newspapers
sentence,
called it a scandal.
30 to 50
Some hailed it as
years
justice.
in prison. The
Others
weight
called
of
it
it
corruption.
finally hit.
But to Luciano,
For a man who had built
it
an
was simply
empire
proof
from
that
nothing,
power doesn't
who had
die.
survived wars,
It just changes
betrayals,
forms. He wasn't
and
free for
assassination
long.
plots.
His release
It was
came
not
with
the
one
violence
condition
that broke him.
deportation.
It was
The United
confinement.
States, the king of
No
the underworld,
longer one
was
of
now a
Lucky
prisoner,
Luciano.
caged
He was
by
to be
the
sent
very
back to
system
Italy,
he thought he
the
controlled.
country he had left
as
as a
guards
child.
led him away.
Now a
He
stranger
turned to a
in the land of
reporter
his birth.
and said,
As the ship
quietly,
departed New York
"Tell them I'll be
Harbor,
back." Luciano
but
stood
deep
on
down,
deck. He knew the
watching
truth.
the skyline
The
shrink
fall had
into the
begun
fog.
long before
The
his
city he
arrest.
had once
It had
ruled
started the moment he
disappeared behind him.
believed he was
But his
untouchable.
empire,
In
the
the
one
months
he
that
built from
followed,
nothing,
the empire
still
he had
pulsed
built
beneath
began
the
to splinter.
streets.
The
Genovese's
narration
positioned
closes with the
himself
sound
as
of
acting
waves
boss.
breaking against
Costello
the hull
tried
in a
to
single,
preserve order,
steady voice.
and Lansky
They
kept the
thought they were
financial
sending him
networks
away.
alive.
But Lucky
Yet without
Luciano
Luciano's
was never just a
guiding
man.
hand.
He was an
The
idea.
balance faltered.
And ideas
The commission
don't vanish.
survived.
They
But the
adapt.
unity of vision,
The fall of the king
that
had
cold,
begun.
calculated
But even in
brilliance,
exile,
was
the
gone.
king still
Behind
had pieces
bars,
on the board. Luciano remained a legend. But legends don't rule empires. They haunt them. By
Luciano's
1935,
life
inside
the streets of
Clinton
New York
Correctional
no
Facility
longer
in
whispered
Dannemora,
Lucky Luciano's
known
name.
grimly,
They shouted
as Little Siberia.
He had become more
was a
than
stark
a gangster.
contrast to his days.
He was a
at the
myth,
Waldorf
a
Astoria.
figure woven
Gone with
into
the
the
silk
fabric
suits
of
private
American
chauffeurs
corruption
and
judges
lavish dinners.
dined with his men.
In their place
Police
came the
chiefs
cold
nodded when
clang
his
of
envelopes
metal
arrived.
doors.
To
The
most,
scratch of rough
he seemed
wool uniforms
untouchable
and the
endless
invisible
monotony
behind a
of
wall
prison
of
life.
power. For a man who had
Influence
once
and
commanded the
silence.
underworld
But
with a
behind that
single phone
illusion,
call,
a storm
confinement
was
was the
gathering.
cruelest
Thomas
punishment
E. Dewey,
imaginable.
a determined
At
young
first,
prosecutor
Luciano
with a reputation
tried
for
to adapt.
incorruptibility.
He played cards,
had set his sights
smoked
on
when he
destroying
could,
the mafia,
and stayed polite
while
with
others
guards
saw
who treated
Luciano
him
as a
ghost in
curiosity
tailored suits.
more than a threat.
Dewey saw a
Even in
man,
prison,
flesh,
he maintained an
blood,
aura
and
of greed.
command.
The
The
other
other
inmates
inmates
called him
Boss
Boss
Charlie.
He didn't want to arrest.
They knew he was
Luciano
no ordinary
orders
criminal
or shut down
He
his
carried
rackets.
himself with the
He wanted to
quiet
cut off
confidence
the
of
head
a
of the
man
serpent.
who still
The
held
battle began
invisible power.
quietly.
Yet
In the
beneath
shadows
the
of the
comic
city's
exterior,
brothels
Luciano's
and back
mind
alleys.
never stopped working.
Dewey understood
His network
something
on the
most
outside
lawmen
continued
didn't.
to function.
That Luciano's
Thanks largely
empire
to
wasn't
Frank
built on
Costello,
violence,
but
and
on
Meyer
systems.
Lansky.
The
Costello
Costello
managed
the
unions,
political
the
contacts,
gambling
and business
rings,
fronts,
all
keeping
operated
cash
like a
flowing
corporate
through
web,
casinos,
each layer
and unions.
protecting the one above.
Lansky,
If he could
ever the
trace the money,
strategist,
he could
handled
find
the
a man
finances with
pulling the
surgical
strings.
precision.
Dewey's
Ensuring that
investigators
Luciano's
began
fortune
raiding
didn't
brothels
vanish
across
under
Manhattan.
government scrutiny.
Night after night,
Even from behind
police
bars,
wagons hauled
Luciano
in madams and
received
prostitutes.
coded messages
Most
about
refused to
profits,
speak,
operations,
terrified of the
and
repercussions.
betrayals. But
Updates
Dewey's
smuggled
team
in
played
through
a different
lawyers
game.
and visitors.
They offered
But
safety,
prison also gave him time to
relocation,
reflect.
and freedom in
For the
exchange
first time
for
since his
testimony.
teenage years,
Slowly,
Luciano
the silence
had no
began
deals
to
to
crack.
make.
Among
no
the first
meetings
to talk was a
attend,
madam
no wars
named
to fight.
Mildred the
He began
Countess
to think
Brinley.
about the price
Then
of
came
power.
Cokie Flo
The friends
Brown,
buried,
a
the
heroin
women
addict
lost,
who ran several
the constant
brothels
fear that
linked
tomorrow
to Luciano's
might
network.
bring an
Flo had
assassin's bullet.
nothing left to lose.
He had risen
Her
higher
testimony
than anyone
became
in
the
mafia's
nail
history.
in the coffin.
Yet he
She
now
described
lived
meetings
in
with
a
Luciano's
6x8
men,
cell.
the
In his
payoffs
quiet
to
moments,
police, and the
he
way
admitted
profits
to
were
himself
delivered
that
through
maybe Dewey
intermediaries
hadn't
straight to
destroyed
Charlie
him.
Lucky.
Maybe
She
he
even
had
recounted
destroyed
one
himself.
moment where she was
Still,
told he refused
boss
to show
don't get his
weakness.
hands dirty.
When journalists
But his
asked if he
fingerprints
regretted
are
anything,
everywhere.
he smirked and
Luciano's
said,
defense
only getting
tried
caught.
to dismiss
It was
these
part bravado,
witnesses
part
as
truth.
unreliable.
Luciano had
After
built
all,
his empire
what
on
credibility
the belief
did
that
drug
emotion
addicts and
was a
sex
liability.
workers have?
But even he
Dewey
couldn't
was
hide the sting
brilliant.
of watching
He didn't
others
build
control
his case on
what
character.
he had once ruled.
He built it on
the
connection.
world outside.
He
was
had
changing.
paperwork
By the
phone
late
records,
1930s,
and patterns of money
Vito
flow that
Genovese,
corroborated
who had
every
fled
claim.
to Italy to avoid
Piece by
prosecution,
piece, the
was growing
invisible
closer
empire
to
began to
Mussolini's
take shape
fascist
in the
regime,
public's imagination.
using his influence
And at
to
its center
expand the mafia's
stood
power
Luciano.
overseas. As the press
Meanwhile,
caught wind of Dewey's
Costello's
campaign,
political
the
empire
narrative
in New York
exploded.
grew stronger.
Newspapers
Fueled
ran
by his connections
sensational
to
headlines.
judges and city officials.
Vice empire.
Luciano
exposed.
was both proud
Luciano
and wary.
linked to
The
200
empire he'd
brothels.
built was
For
thriving,
years.
but it was
Luciano had
evolving
paid
without him.
journalists to
In
protect his
1940,
image. He received an
portraying him
unexpected
as a
visit from a
businessman.
reporter.
Now
who
those
asked
same
him whether
papers
he
were
still
calling him the
considered
king of
himself
vice.
the boss of
Inside
bosses.
his Waldorf
Luciano
Tower
chuckled
suite,
and replied,
Luciano read
"There's
the
no such
headlines thing
over
as a boss
breakfast,
of bosses.
calm but
We're all
calculating.
just businessmen.
He had faced trouble
some with
before.
better lawyers.
They always want a
The
king
remark
to
was a
kill,
subtle
he
jab
told
at Dewey,
Costello.
but it
Let them
also
try.
reflected a
But
new
this time,
awareness.
the hunt felt
Luciano
different.
knew that
Dewey
his
wasn't a
legend had
politician
outgrown
looking
him.
for a deal.
The world saw
he was a
him
crusader.
as a myth.
He couldn't be
a symbol
bribed,
of organized
couldn't be
crime
reasoned
itself.
with,
And
couldn't
myths,
be scared.
he realized,
the hidden war
never
became
die,
psychological.
they transform.
Luciano
Inside the prison,
ordered his lawyers
Luciano
to delay
found
subpoenas,
small ways
intimidate
to exert
witnesses,
control.
and
He
flood the
arranged
courts
for
with
better
motions.
food but
got
the walls
special
kept
privileges for
closing
certain inmates.
Each week brought
and
new
quietly
arrests,
built influence
new
over the
witnesses,
guards.
new evidence.
Money still talked.
Dewey's
Even
grand
in
jury
Dannemora.
sessions were like
Soon,
slow executions.
rumors spread that
one
Luciano
piece of
had
Luciano's
more freedom
empire
than
dying
any
of
prisoner
time.
in the facility.
When Dewey
That he
finally
could host
issued
card
a
games,
warrant for Luciano's
receive
arrest
fine cigars,
in March 1936,
even have meals prepared
the news
specially
sent
for him.
shockwaves.
The
through
warden
the city.
denied it.
The
But
mighty
everyone
boss
knew the truth.
disappeared overnight.
Luciano was still a
Newspapers
boss,
speculated he had
even
fled
in
to
chains.
Cuba,
Yet,
to Mexico,
as war
even to
clouds
Europe.
gathered over
In
Europe,
truth,
the
Luciano
future
was
took a
hiding in
strange turn.
plain sight.
The United States
At friend's
would
home
soon
in
enter
Hot
World
Springs,
War II,
Arkansas,
and the Navy
a
faced
town
a
famous for
growing
its crooked
problem.
politics and
Enemy
friendly
sabotage
police.
along the
But
docks of
Dewey's
New York
reach
Harbor.
extended further
Rumors
than Luciano
spread that
anticipated.
German agents were
Through federal
sinking
cooperation
American
ships.
Agents
And the
tracked him
authorities
down,
feared
surrounded his
infiltration
hotel
along the waterfront.
and arrested him
The docks,
without a
however,
shot fired.
were
The
controlled
man
by
who
one
once
group,
ruled the underworld with
Mafia.
absolute
It was
power
Meyer
was
Lansky
dragged
who
from his
first
bed in
suggested
pajamas.
a bold idea,
a symbol of how
used
far he
Luciano's
had fallen.
influence to
As he was
protect the
escorted
ports.
back to New
Through
York
his
in
network,
handcuffs, Lansky
reporters
approached
swarmed
military
the train
intelligence
stations.
officers.
Cameras
Hinting that
flashed.
Luciano could
People
ensure
shouted his
cooperation
name.
from
He didn't
longshoremen
flinch.
and dock
He
workers
just
in
smiled
exchange
faintly.
for certain considerations.
Cigarette between his lips.
The government
and
was
said,
skeptical at
"Tell
first,
Dewey I'll see him
but
in
as ships
court."
continued
The
to
trial that
explode
followed was not
mysteriously,
just a legal
desperation
proceeding.
grew.
It was
Eventually,
Dewey
a
presented
arrangement
67
was made,
witnesses,
one that would
each
later be
painting
known
a picture
as
of a man
Operation
who had
Underworld.
turned sin
From his
into
prison
industry.
cell, Luciano's
Lucky
defense
Luciano
tried
suddenly
to portray
became
him
an
as a
asset
legitimate
to the U.S.
businessman.
government.
But the
He ordered
evidence
his contacts
was
in the docks
overwhelming.
to maintain
The jury didn't
strict
take
discipline.
long. Guilty,
Eliminate
any
any
saboteurs,
62 counts
and
of
assist
compulsory
naval intelligence
prostitution.
with information.
The judge's words
Within
cut
weeks,
like
the incident
steel.
stopped.
You have
Whether
corrupted
it was
the
because of
very
Luciano's
soul of the city.
intervention or
For that,
coincidence remains
I sentence you to
debated.
30
But to the
to
Navy,
50 years
the
in
results
prison.
spoke for themselves.
The courtroom erupted.
For the first time in years,
half in applause,
Luciano
half
saw
in
a
shock.
glimmer of
The
opportunity.
king of organized
His cooperation
crime,
had
the
given him
architect
leverage.
of modern mafia
A bargaining
structure
chip was
for
being led
freedom.
away in chains.
Though he remained
But as the guards
officially a
took him down the
prisoner,
courthouse
he began to
steps,
receive visitors
Luciano
from military
turned to one of his
intelligence
men
and
political
said
figures,
quietly,
"Don't
all
worry.
eager to
I built
thank
something
him
that
for his
doesn't
patriotic
die."
service.
The voiceover
It was an
fades
irony that
as the
amused
camera
him
pans from the
deeply.
courthouse
The
to
same
the
glittering
government that called him the
skyline
Lord
of
of
New York.
Crime.
The
now
narration
relied on him
whispers
to
the
protect
government
nation.
thought it had
By the time
ended
the war
empire
ended in
of Lucky
1945,
Luciano. What they didn't
Luciano had
understand
spent nearly
was
a
that
decade
power,
behind bars.
once
He
organized,
was older,
doesn't vanish.
heavier,
It
and
adapts,
more introspective,
it hides,
but
and it
not
waits.
defeated.
The
Operation
hidden war was
Underworld
over,
had changed
and yet
everything.
deep in the
It had
shadows,
made him useful
another
again,
one,
and
silent,
usefulness was power.
invisible.
He
and
knew
far
that
more
soon
dangerous.
someone in the
was
system
just
would want to
beginning.
repay the favor. Luciano's rise from the streets of Lower Manhattan had always been about survival, turning weakness into strength, chaos into opportunity. Prison had not broken that instinct. It had refined it, and though his cell doors still locked every night, deep inside, he could feel it. His next move was already unfolding. In
When the gavel
1946,
struck
and Charles Lucky
happened.
Luciano
Charles
was sentenced to
Lucky
50
Luciano
years
was
behind
released
bars.
from prison.
It felt like
Officially,
the end of an era. It was a
newspapers
deportation.
across
not a
America
pardon.
printed the story
Governor
in
Dewey,
bold
the
letters.
same man who had
Lucky
destroyed him a
falls.
decade
For the first
earlier,
time,
agreed
the
to
myth of
commute
the
his
untouchable
sentence in
mobster had been
recognition
shattered.
of Luciano's
The man who had turned New
wartime
York's chaos
cooperation.
into corporate crime
Unofficially,
was
it was
now
a trade,
just another inmate.
freedom for silence.
Yet inside the cold
influence
walls
for
of Clinton
exile.
Correctional Facility,
Luciano walked
Dannemora
out of
prison.
Dannemora prison
Luciano
after nearly
was
10
anything
years
but
behind
broken.
bars. No longer an
Stripped of his
inmate,
tailored
but not
suits,
truly a free
denied his
man
fine
either.
cigars.
His destination,
He remained composed,
Italy, as the
methodical,
ship carrying him
and eerily
crossed the
confident.
Atlantic. To him,
Luciano
prison
stood at
wasn't
the
the
railing,
end of his reign,
staring at the
it was
endless
simply a
horizon.
new office.
For the
with
first
iron
time
bars.
since his youth,
he knew one
he was
thing
leaving
the
the
state
country
did
he had
not.
helped shape.
He had
from
built
shadows.
something that could survive
America
without
had
him.
made him
The
powerful.
commission and his
and cast him out.
brainchild was
Yet,
functioning like
even
a
in
machine.
exile,
Each
Luciano
family still had to
refused to
see himself.
each
as
boss
finished.
still followed
They can take
the
me out of
code.
America,
And his allies
he
like
told
Frank
the journalist
Costello,
later.
but
Meyer
they can't take
Lansky,
America
and Joe
out of me.
Adonis ensured his
When he
words
arrived
still
in
echoed
Naples,
through
he was
every
greeted
decision
not
made
by
on streets,
friends,
but by
letters,
Italian police,
coded messages,
and plainclothes
and
American
whispered
agents.
instructions.
They
smuggled
shadowed his
through
every
lawyers
move,
and visitors,
photographing
kept Luciano's
him in cafes,
influence alive.
following him
Even
through the
behind
narrow alleys
bars,
of the
he
city.
was approving
The
hits,
Allies feared he
settling
might
disputes,
rebuild his
and
empire
maintaining
in Europe.
discipline within
In
the
truth,
organization.
that was
The press
exactly
might
what
have
he
called him
intended.
finished.
Naples
but
was
inside
poor
the
and
underworld,
broken after the war.
He remained the
a place
place of black markets,
the outside world,
smuggling,
however, had
and
changed.
desperation.
Dewey's
Luciano,
crusade had turned the
it looked
mafia
familiar.
into a public
Opportunity
villain,
was
and politicians
everywhere.
were eager to
He
show
quickly
they were tough on established
crime.
himself,
But
in a
even as
luxury
prosecutors
hotel
celebrated
suite,
their victory,
turning it into
the
an
city's
informal
vice
headquarters.
operations continued.
Former mob
Quieter,
associates visited
more
from New
efficient,
York and Cuba,
and far more discreet.
carrying messages.
Luciano's
cash,
design had
and
outlived
loyalty.
his freedom.
Luciano
Meanwhile,
began to reassert
America
control
itself
over
was
international
shifting toward a
narcotics
new
trafficking.
kind of war.
Using
In
Italy
Europe,
as a hub,
Hitler's armies
France
were
as the
spreading,
processor,
and whispers
and
of
America
another global
as the
conflict filled
This
the
would
air.
become the
And
infamous
it was in this
tension
tension
that the man who had been
a
branded a
pipeline
criminal
that would dominate
once
the
again
heroin
become
trade for
useful
decades.
to the
But
very
it wasn't just
government
business
that condemned him.
Luciano
in
longed for
1942,
connection to his
the
old
U.S.
world.
faced
The
a problem.
streets,
German
the
submarines
voices,
were
the
sabotaging
pulse of New
ships
York.
along the East
He began
Coast,
coordinating
including
meetings
with
with
Meyer
New York
Lansky.
The Navy's
Frank
suspected
Costello
Axis spies
and
had
Vito
infiltrated the
Genovese,
docks,
who had returned
which were
from
largely
Italy
controlled
to
by the
reclaim
mob.
power.
Desperate for
Together,
help,
they turned to
discussed
an
the
unlikely
next ally
evolution
of
of organized
crime.
Operation
Casinos
Underworld
in
was
Havana,
born. Gambling
a secret
operations
alliance
in Las
between the
Vegas,
U
and political
S,
investments that would
Navy,
outlive
and the
any
Mafia.
single dawn.
And
though
at the
technically
center
in
of it
exile,
was Lucky
Luciano's words
from his
still
prison
carried
cell.
weight. Luciano
Then came
agreed
Havana,
to assist the government in
1946,
exchange for better
a
conditions,
moment that would seal
and
his legend.
Later, the
A
world's
chance at
most
freedom.
powerful
Through his
mobsters
connections,
gathered in Cuba,
mob
for
control
what became
dock
known
workers
as the
ensured
Havana
no
Conference,
sabotage
organized under the
in the
guise
dark
of a
irony
business
of
summit.
history.
Luciano,
The same man
once
once
hunted as
quietly
America's
by ship,
greatest criminal,
using
was
bribed
now
officials
helping
to
protect
evade
it.
detection.
When the war
When
ended,
he entered the grand ballroom
Luciano's
of the Hotel
cooperation
Nacional,
became a political
every
opportunity.
major figure in
By
organized
1946,
crime stood to
after
greet
a
him.
decade
They
behind
called him
bars,
boss.
the New York State
It was a
Parole
coronation
Board,
of sorts.
under pressure
The
from
exiled
powerful
king
figures,
returning
commuted
to
his
his
sentence.
sentence.
At the
There was
conference,
one condition.
Luciano
He would be
outlined
deported
his
to
vision
Italy
for the mafia's
and never
future.
return to the United
No
States.
single leader.
On
but a
February
board,
10th,
a commission
1946,
that would ensure stability.
Luciano boarded
and
a ship
prevent
bound for
wars.
Naples.
Each family
As
would
he stood
share
on the deck,
power, watching the
profits,
Manhattan
and
skyline
peace.
fade into the
The
distance.
idea wasn't
He
new.
smirked. He
and
had
said to a
created it
reporter,
years earlier.
"They can send me
but now it
anywhere,
was reborn.
but they
on a
can't
global
deport my
scale.
brain."
His speech
In
reminded
Italy,
them that
he was
greed
greeted
and
as
ego
both a
had
legend
nearly
and a
destroyed
ghost.
the mafia.
The old mafia clans
the only
of
way
Sicily
forward
saw
was
him
organization
as the American
a
visionary,
criminal democracy
who had transformed
the
criminal
criminal
brief
world
months
into a business
It
empire.
seemed Luciano
but
had
Luciano
reclaimed his
wasn't
empire.
content to
The
fade
Havana
away
casinos
quietly.
buzzed
He
with
began
American money,
rebuilding,
and his
connecting
influence
the Italian
stretched
mafia
from
with
New
the
York to
American
Naples.
families he
But
had
success
once led,
brought attention.
creating an international network for narcotics trafficking.
Intelligence
that stretched
discovered
from
his
Europe
presence
to
in
Cuba
Cuba
to the U.S.
and demanded his removal.
While officially in
Under
exile,
pressure,
the
Luciano
Cuban
was
government
still in
forced
command.
Luciano
He
to
oversaw
return to Italy.
meetings with Lansky
Once again,
in Havana,
his empire dissolved
negotiated
into smoke.
deals with
Back
Sicilian
in
bosses,
Naples,
his
and
health
reestablished
began
his
to decline.
influence
Years
in
of
the drug
stress,
trade. The
prison
Lucky
food,
Luciano
and
brand
heavy
had gone
smoking
global.
took their
The
toll.
world might have
Yet,
called him a fallen
he
man,
remained sharp,
but in
truth,
corresponding with
he had
friends
simply
and
evolved.
managing his
Meanwhile,
network quietly.
back in New York,
younger gangsters
Thomas
still
Dewey,
sought his
now
advice.
a governor and
They came to
political
him not for
celebrity,
orders,
still lived
but for
under
wisdom.
Luciano's shadow.
Luciano had become
He had
something
won the
more
war,
than a mob boss,
but the peace was another
He was a
matter.
symbol,
The mafia
the architect
had not
of
vanished.
modern organized crime.
It had adapted.
The man who
The
had
commission
turned
still
chaos into
ruled.
order.
Rackets
Despite
still
the
thrived,
isolation,
and
Luciano found a
blueprint for
strange
organized
peace
crime
in his later
became the
years.
foundation
He walked
for
the
generations
streets of
of
Naples
gangsters to come.
anonymously.
As the years
sometimes
passed,
buying espresso
Luciano's
at a corner
health
cafe,
declined, where
he
no
lived
one
in
recognized
Naples
him.
under
The
quiet
ambition that had
surveillance,
once burned
a relic
so
of a bygone
fiercely
era,
had cooled into
Yet,
reflection.
in his final days,
he knew he would never
he
return
remained
to America,
reflective, but
rather
perhaps
than
that was
remorseful.
justice. He often
I
told
made the
visitors,
rules, he once said.
I gave the boys
and I paid
rules.
for them.
I made
Still,
them businessmen.
even in exile,
Before me,
he couldn't
they were
escape
animals.
the game.
The
In
narcotics
1962,
route he helped
at the Naples
establish
airport,
continued
Luciano
to expand,
collapsed,
enriching
died of a
syndicates
heart attack
worldwide.
moments after
The
meeting a
American
producer about
Mafia
a movie
flourished
based on
under his
life.
design. It was almost
Disciplined,
poetic,
structured,
the man who had
nearly
turned
invisible.
reality into
Luciano's
myth dying
absence
while
had
trying
not
to control
weakened
the
the
legend.
system.
His
It had
death did
perfected
not
it.
end his story.
By the mid-1950s,
his body was eventually
law
returned to
enforcement
New York,
agencies across
buried in
two
St.
continents
John's
still
Cemetery,
viewed him as
not
a
far
threat.
from many of the
The
men he
Italian
once
government
commanded.
placed him under
Mourners from
surveillance,
both sides of
yet
the law
no
attended.
concrete charges
Mobsters,
stuck.
politicians,
To the end,
and ordinary
Lucky
New
Luciano
Yorkers who had lived in the
remained
world he helped
untouchable.
build.
A ghost of the
Luciano's
old world
empire
who could still
never
move
truly
nations
died.
through whispers.
It lived on
and
in
though
the
he would
commission,
never
in
again
the global
walk the
drug routes
streets he
New York.
envisioned.
His
In the
shadow
codes of
lingered
silence and power
in every
that
union
defined
deal,
organized
casino
crime for
floor,
decades.
and whispered
Even in
death,
meeting between men who
Lucky
owed their
Luciano
power to the man
remained
what
who
he
built
always
the
wanted to be
mafia.
his future, the man who rewrote the rules. And as the camera fades to black, the narration closes with a whisper that lingers like smoke over the city skyline. In the end, Lucky Luciano didn't just build an empire, he built a system. One that proved even kings could fall, but the crown always finds another head. When Lucky Luciano's iron cell door clanged shut in 1936, most men would have seen it as the end of their empire. But Luciano wasn't most men. To him,
The prison walls weren't barriers. They were boundaries to be mapped, systems to be understood, and men to be managed. Even stripped of his suits, his luxury, and his freedom, Luciano remained what he had always been, a strategist. From the beginning, he refused to act defeated. Other inmates quickly recognized that this wasn't just another convict. Luciano carried himself with quiet authority, never loud, never arrogant, but with an unmistakable command presence. Guards noted his politeness, his calm demeanor, his ability to read people. He understood psychology better than most psychologists. It was how he'd ruled the streets, and now it was how he would survive prison. He was first held at Clinton Correctional Facility, better known as Dannemora, a cold fortress of stone on the edge of the Adirondacks. It was brutal, overcrowded, and filled with hardened men. But within months, Luciano had created order. He built alliances with influential inmates, befriended guards, and even arranged small privileges through favors and negotiation. No bribes, no threats, just subtle power. His influence began to seep beyond the prison walls. He communicated with his trusted lieutenants, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis, through coded messages smuggled in by lawyers and visitors. Every word was crafted carefully, each letter a piece of strategy. The commission, the governing body he had created for the Mafia, continued to function smoothly, almost as if its founder had never left. In a strange way, Luciano's imprisonment strengthened his myth. Newspapers called him the invisible boss. To the public, he was a phantom orchestrating New York's underworld from behind bars. The idea terrified authorities and inspired criminals alike. Luciano had turned his punishment into proof of his genius, the ultimate demonstration of control through distance. Meanwhile, his allies outside flourished. Frank Costello became the de facto head of the organization in New York, managing political relationships and keeping the peace among families. Lansky expanded gambling operations into Cuba and Florida, ensuring a steady flow of money. Even Bugsy Siegel, though reckless, represented Luciano's expanding influence in Hollywood and Las Vegas. Every dollar earned, every hit approved, every territory negotiated carried Luciano's shadow. His word, even unspoken, still meant law. Inside prison, Luciano's daily life was regimented, but he used it to sharpen his mind. He read voraciously, Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, law texts, and reflected on his own philosophy of power. He began to view his empire less as a criminal network and more as a psychological construct. Power, he once told a fellow inmate, isn't where you stand. It's what others believe about where you stand. And that belief still surrounded him. When guards or warden staff approached, they treated him with an odd mix of fear and respect. He was the only prisoner who never had to shout or demand. Things simply happened around him. Then came World War II, and with it a strange twist of fate. In 1942, German submarines were sabotaging U.S. ships near New York Harbor. The Navy feared Axis spies had infiltrated the docks that, ironically, were controlled by Luciano's men. Desperate, the government struck a secret deal. Through intermediaries, naval intelligence reached out to the Mafia for help securing the docks. Luciano agreed, offering his influence in exchange for better conditions and, potentially, leniency. Thus began Operation Underworld, a clandestine alliance between the U.S. Navy and America's most powerful mobster. From his cell, Luciano used his connections to ensure dock workers cooperated, that security was restored, and that no sabotage occurred. It was one of history's strangest partnerships, the criminal mastermind helping defend the nation that had condemned him. For Luciano, it was redemption through strategy. He didn't need to fight or plead. He simply made himself useful. By the war's end, his cooperation had become public knowledge within certain political circles, and whispers began that the government owed him something. By 1945, after nearly a decade in prison, Luciano's influence had not only endured, it had expanded. He had become a paradox, a prisoner who ruled without moving, a king without a throne who still controlled the court. When Governor Dewey, his old nemesis, finally commuted his sentence in 1946 on the condition of deportation, it wasn't out of mercy. It was practicality. Luciano was no longer a criminal threat. He was a political problem, an embarrassment too powerful to ignore and too connected to destroy. As he packed his few belongings and prepared to leave, Luciano smiled faintly. Behind him, the cell door that had once symbolized defeat now felt like just another closed chapter in a much longer book. The man who had built an empire on control had proven his greatest lesson yet. True power doesn't vanish with circumstance, it adapts. And even as he boarded the ship that would exile him from America forever, one truth remained. Lucky Luciano had never really left. His empire, his system, his legend, all still thrived, humming quietly beneath the surface of a nation that had tried to bury him. When Lucky Luciano, the story of Lucky Luciano ship in Naples not merely in 1946. It is the story of a man who rewrote the architecture of exile. His life moved like a cinematic crowded with sailors and locals, from a poor Sicilian immigrant boy for the first time since his teenage years, to the architect Luciano was back on Italian soil, to an aging exile. But this was not his home. Staring at the sea America, Naples, the streets of the Lower East Side, the Empire, the hotels of Manhattan. The night stage revealed a different truth about ambition. Italy was loyalty, a foreign stage, and the price of control. And he was an old. The closing scene of Luciano's life feels strangely. He was escorted by police and reporters who shouted questions. A place of departures, dressed sharply as always, symbolizing the endless motion that defined his existence. Luciano appeared. He had spent his life moving between worlds. He was already between legality. He knew that a man like him between Italy and America. Between power wasn't something you gave up, even in death. It was something that he stood at a threshold. In Naples, suspended, the government placed him under surveillance, never fully reconciled. They feared he might Luciano's story endure the Sicilian Mafia just the or interfere in Italian politics. But the psychology, they were right to worry. He wasn't driven by bloodlust. Luciano began reconnecting with the by an obsessive need to impose men who remembered him, where others saw the Mafia who had as a collection of violent. But Luciano wasn't interested in street-level rackets anymore. Something that could be his ambitions had disciplined. He began thinking globally. His genius during his years in prison. He had watched the world shift. He replaced fear, empire's functionality, economy turning loyalty into a contract, and betrayal. The new frontier wasn't bootlegging in a sense. He transformed. It was criminal instinct into corporate logic. Produced in Europe before the world coined America, was becoming the next great. Every system built on human ambition. And Luciano eventually turned its potential before almost Luciano's empire from his villa so carefully designed. He quietly began constructing, became corrupted by greed. One that connected Sicilian suppliers to Corsican smugglers. The organization he had built to prevent chaos was consumed by it. Many of them that even the most brilliant structures coordinated shipments through darker instincts of human nature. And his life serves as a timeless. It was a complex, decentralized system order to the underworld. His old mafia commissions to his own now span continents. As decades to outsiders, his myth he appeared to be living quietly. Books, the Italian documentaries saw him walking the streets, each one shaping a different version of Lucky Luciano. But behind the scenes, he was orchestrating one of the first the tragic global drug syndicates, the pragmatic genius. His right-hand man in pop culture, including Meyer he became an archetype. Santo the original Godfather helped to move the product cinematic dons who came through the Caribbean. But behind the charisma and cunning was something more fragile. In 1947, a man who wanted to reunited with Lansky and other associates in Havana. His deepest fear was not under Batista's but irrelevance. Had become a haven in his final for years. Mobsters, Luciano gamblers, once told a businessman, "The perfect playground for a man like Luciano." Maybe the meeting was legendary. It was an dozens of mafia leaders attended. The mafia, including Frank Costello, organized, became an institution that endured far beyond its founder. They gathered at even the Hotel Nacional, prosecutors and modern policing dismantled its reality power. It was a reassertion of Luciano's authority, unions, and reminder to everyone that he still sat at the head of the silent code, even in exile. The language of loyalty. For days, Havana buzzed with rumors of the mob. But perhaps the most haunting legacy Luciano left was philosophical. And future enterprises his life posed uncomfortable including questions. The expansion of casinos, where does order and narcotics traffic and corruption begin? To the American families, how different are the men in Luciano's presence was symbolic. Luciano, the architect of order, had returned so effectively the U.S. that the mafia became a mirror. When word reached Washington, his empire mounted exposed the uncomfortable truth that systems, within weeks, whether he was forced to leave Havana and return to Italy, on the same principles. A bitter blow.
Discipline,
the end of his
secrecy,
physical reach,
and the manipulation
of the
American
American
underworld.
Even now,
Though his ideas
more than half a
remained
century
woven
after his
into
death,
its fabric,
his shadow
from that
remains.
moment,
In New
Luciano
York,
transitioned
the streets
from
where he
leader
once
to
ruled
legend,
are
a ghost who
unrecognizable.
haunted every
Yet his name
corner
still
of organized
echoes
crime.
and whispers
In
among
Italy,
historians
under
and
near constant
storytellers.
surveillance,
His
he
portrait
lived
appears
modestly,
in museums,
but comfortably.
his strategies and
He often
academic
entertained
studies,
visitors,
his legend in
young
film
mobsters
scripts,
seeking
for
wisdom,
man exiled,
journalists seeking
silenced,
quotes,
and
filmmakers
buried.
seeking rights.
Luciano
for his life
achieved
story.
what few
He was
men
always
ever
polite,
do,
always measured.
immortality.
When asked if
And
he regretted
perhaps
his life,
that is the final
he'd
irony.
shrug and say,
Lucky Luciano
I did what I had
sought
to do.
control
Everyone
over
plays the
everything.
hand they're dealt.
His business,
By the
his
late
men,
1950s,
his destiny.
the world
But in the
had
end,
changed
it was
again.
the story
The
of
mafia
Lucky
had
Luciano
evolved
that
into a
controlled him.
multinational
The myth
entity,
devoured
and the
man.
drug trade
What
Luciano
began as a
had
quest
envisioned
for
was
power
booming.
became a
Yet,
parable about
despite
the
his
nature of
influence,
it.
he was no
How
longer
every
truly
empire,
part of it. No
he was
matter
an
how
old general
brilliant
without a
is
battlefield,
built on human
respected,
fragility.
but
The
obsolete.
camera of history
Still,
closes
he found
on
purpose
him,
in
not
reflection.
as a monster.
He kept
or a
detailed
hero,
notes about
but
his
as both,
life,
hoping
a visionary
one day
criminal
to tell
who
his version of the
understood people
story.
better than he
Not the
understood
one
himself.
written by prosecutors
The last
or
image is
journalists,
not of
but the one
violence
written by
or
the man
triumph,
himself.
but of
They
reflection.
call me a criminal,
An
he
old
once
man on a
said,
balcony,
but I
in
gave
Naples,
rules to men
cigarette
who
in
didn't
hand.
have any.
Watching
Without
the
me,
sea, he
there'd
once
be
crossed
chaos.
to change the world.
I built order
His
my way.
empire crumbled.
On January
His enemies
26th,
died. His allies
1962,
vanished.
but his
Luciano
vision,
arranged to
cold,
meet with a film
brilliant,
producer
and
at Naples
unapologetically
International
human
Airport to discuss a
endured,
movie because
based on
Lucky
his life.
Luciano didn't
He
just
arrived
build
early,
the mafia's
dressed
future.
impeccably.
He built a
a
mirror
faint
smile
smile
on his face, one that
But
still
moments after
reflects the
shaking
timeless
hands with the
truth
producer,
that power
he collapsed
in
to the
any
ground.
form.
His heart
always
had
comes
finally
at a price.
given out.
As the police arrived and the crowd gathered, someone whispered, "That's Lucky Luciano." Even in death, his name commanded awe. The newspapers the next morning called him the last king of the mafia. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York, the city that had made him, destroyed him, and immortalized him. And as his coffin was lowered into the ground, surrounded by men who had once called him boss, one thing was certain: exile had never truly erased Lucky Luciano. He had outlived the system that imprisoned him, outsmarted the enemies who hunted him, and outlasted the world that tried to forget him. In the end, the architect of organized crime died as he had lived, in control of his story, leaving behind not just a criminal empire, but a blueprint for power that would echo through history. Something far more enduring than any tale of crime or glamour. A system, a framework of power, loyalty, and calculated ruthlessness that still echoes through the underworld today. Luciano's greatest legacy was not the money he made or the empire he ruled. It was the idea that crime could be organized. Before him, the mafia was a chaotic collection of feuding gangs, each chasing its own slice of the city. Violence was constant, leadership unstable, and greed unchecked. Luciano changed that in the quiet years after his death. Lucky Luciano became more than a man. He became a myth. His story, retold in whispers across smoky bars, FBI files, and cinema screens, blurred the line between legend and reality. But behind the myth lies Ver. He understood that chaos was bad for business. He saw that the mafia needed rules, structure, and discipline, the same things that made legitimate corporations thrive. His creation of the commission was revolutionary, a governing council of family bosses that could mediate disputes, divide territories, and enforce peace. In doing so, he gave the criminal world a constitution, an invisible government operating within the shadows of the real one. Through this structure, Luciano ensured that organized crime could survive beyond any single man's fault, even his own, and it did. After his imprisonment and eventual exile, the commission continued to operate smoothly. The Luciano family became the Genovese family. The system evolved, but its DNA remained his. Law enforcement soon realized they weren't fighting individuals anymore. They were fighting a network. The FBI's attempts to dismantle the mafia in the 1950s and 60s, from the Kefauver hearings to the Appalachian Raid, were essentially battles against Luciano's legacy. Every time authorities struck down one boss, another rose seamlessly to take his place. That was the genius of the structure. It made the organization immortal. Even outside the mafia, Luciano's model influenced the very nature of modern organized crime. Drug cartels in Latin America, Yakuza groups in Japan, triads in Hong Kong, all mirrored his principles. Hierarchy, discipline, diversification, and, most importantly, invisibility. The idea that criminal empires could function like businesses with balance sheets and boardrooms was his ultimate gift or curse to the world. But Luciano's influence wasn't limited to the mechanics of crime. It extended into the psychology of power itself. He embodied the paradox of the rational criminal, a man who could be ruthless without rage, strategic without sentiment. His belief in order, efficiency, and loyalty gave him control, but also distanced him from humanity. To maintain power, he learned to suppress emotion. Betrayal, violence, and death were simply parts of the equation. Yet those who knew him personally described a man who carried invisible weight. He could be charming, even warm, but his eyes, they said, always seemed tired, as if he'd seen too much of the human soul. In private moments, he often reflected on the cost of power. "You make yourself untouchable," he once told a friend, "and then you realize nobody ever really touches you again." That contradiction, the desire for control versus the loss of connection, became part of his legend. He wasn't merely a gangster. He was a tragic archetype, the self-made man who rose from poverty to dominance, only to discover that the empire he built consumed him. In film and literature, this image became immortal. Characters like Vito Corleone and Tony Montana owe their narrative DNA to Luciano, men who build empires, enforce codes, and wrestle with the moral weight of their own ambition. Even Hollywood's portrayal of the mafia, refined, calculating, steeped in loyalty, reflects the structure Luciano envisioned in real life. But the real Luciano was neither hero nor villain. He was a man who saw the world for what it was, systems of power competing for control, and chose to master it from the shadows. To some, he was a visionary. To others, a corrupter of the American dream. Both are true. In Italy, he is remembered as the king of the mafia. In America, as the man who built it. But his truest title is simpler, the architect, because long after his body turned to dust, his architecture remained intact, visible in the way organized crime adapted, expanded, and intertwined with legitimate power. Today, economists study his organizational model. Historians call him the father of modern crime, and psychologists see in him a rare kind of intelligence, cold, analytical, born from survival and sharpened by necessity. His name still carries weight, not because of what he did, but because of how he did it. In the end, Lucky Luciano's greatest triumph was also his greatest tragedy. He proved that control is possible, but never peace. That a man can rule the underworld, but never escape it. And so his story endures, not as a tale of victory or failure, but as a mirror, a reflection of ambition, morality, and the eternal question that haunted him to his last breath. Can power ever truly be clean if it's built in the dark? Even decades after his death, Lucky Luciano's shadow still lingers, not just in the criminal underworld, but in the cultural memory of power itself. His life became a story told and retold, reshaped with every generation that tried to understand the thin line between genius and corruption. To some, he was the ultimate symbol of the American underclass rising through sheer intelligence and audacity. To others, he was the embodiment of moral decay hidden beneath the illusion of respectability. The myth of Luciano grew stronger precisely because his life ended without true closure. Dying far from the streets that made him, in exile yet unbroken, he became a ghost that haunted both lawmen and dreamers. In Sicily, whispers said he still controlled things from beyond the grave. In New York, his name was spoken with a strange mixture of fear and admiration, the kind reserved for men who defy systems and somehow win. Cinema, literature, and pop culture turned his image into an archetype. Every calm, calculating mob boss on screen, from Marlon Brando's Don Corleone to modern portrayals in shows like Boardwalk Empire, carries traces of Luciano's persona. The quiet strategist, the man who uses intellect rather than impulse. The myth became more than historical. It became philosophical. It raised timeless questions about order and chaos, power and morality, crime and civilization. Historians often argue that Luciano didn't just organize the mafia. He organized human ambition itself. He showed how the drive for control, once liberated from conscience, can mimic the logic of empires and governments. His legacy reminds us that power, whether in the streets or in the boardroom, follows the same rules: alliances, loyalty, hierarchy, and the willingness to do what others won't. Today, the name Lucky Luciano is spoken less as that of a criminal and more as that of a legend, a cautionary tale and an inspiration wrapped in one. His empire may have fallen, his allies may have vanished, but the ideas he set in motion still pulse quietly in the world's darker corners. Because in every age, there will always be those who study his blueprint, not to destroy it, but to use it. And that is how a man becomes immortal. The year was 1936. America was crawling out of the Great Depression, its cities pulsing with energy, ambition, and corruption. In New York, Thomas E. Dewey, a sharp, ambitious prosecutor with slicked-back hair and an unyielding moral code, had declared war on organized crime. His target wasn't just any gangster. It was the man who had turned the mafia into a corporation, Charles Lucky Luciano. The courtroom drama that followed would not only dismantle the illusion of Luciano's invincibility, but would redefine America's perception of the mafia itself. It began quietly, with whispers in the underworld. Dewey's team, backed by an army of investigators, was gathering evidence, not on gambling or bootlegging, but on something more controversial: prostitution. The state's theory was revolutionary. Luciano, they claimed, was the hidden kingpin behind a vast vice empire, controlling hundreds of brothels through an intricate web of middlemen, madams, and pimps. Luciano laughed at the idea. In his mind, prostitution was small time. He dealt in numbers, narcotics, and unions, the real money. But Dewey wasn't after the business itself. He was after Luciano, the symbol. The trial would be less about vice and more about power, about showing that no man, no matter how feared, could be above the law. When Luciano was arrested in April 1936, the city buzzed with disbelief. He was caught in Arkansas while fleeing what he thought was just a routine raid. Newspapers dubbed him America's #1 racketeer. But as he was escorted back to New York, handcuffed and expressionless, the cameras captured something that frightened his empire. The calm acceptance of a man who understood the game was changing. In the courtroom, Dewey built his case like a stage play. He called witnesses one after another: prostitutes, madams, pimps, all testifying that Luciano was the unseen hand controlling their world. Most of them had never met him directly, but their stories painted a chilling portrait of organization and hierarchy. Luciano's defense, led by the brilliant lawyer George Morton Levy, argued the obvious. There was no proof, no money trail, no direct orders, no documents. It was all hearsay, all constructed by frightened witnesses trying to save themselves. But Dewey didn't need hard evidence. He needed a narrative that made sense to the public, and he had it. Day after day, the press filled the courtroom galleries. Headlines screamed about the vice king and the empire of sin. For the first time, America saw the mafia not as a mysterious, invisible force, but as a system, efficient, disciplined, and deeply corrupting. Luciano sat through it all like a statue. Clean-cut, neatly dressed, he projected an aura of calm authority. Occasionally, he smirked or whispered to his lawyers, but he never lost composure. Behind his stoicism, though, was fury. He knew some of the witnesses, women he had once protected, men who owed him loyalty, and their betrayal burned him more than the accusations. Then came Dewey's closing argument, a masterclass in moral theater. He pointed to Luciano and said, "This man is not merely a criminal. He is the engineer of corruption. He is the man who turned vice into business." Dewey wasn't prosecuting an individual. He was putting an entire system on trial, the one Luciano had built from the ashes of chaos. When the jury returned after less than 9 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on 62 counts. Luciano didn't flinch. The courtroom erupted, reporters scribbling furiously, photographers flashing bulbs. Then came the sentence: 30 to 50 years in state prison. It was a death blow to his freedom, but not to his legend. Dewey emerged as a national hero, his reputation catapulting him toward a future in politics. For Luciano, however, this was the beginning of his mythology. As he was led away in handcuffs, he turned to a reporter and said quietly, "Tell Dewey he'll hear from me again." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Inside Sing Sing prison, the reality hit hard. The cell was small, the walls thick with the damp chill of defeat. For a man accustomed to suites at the Waldorf Astoria, this was another universe. Yet Luciano adapted with the same intelligence that had built his empire. He treated the guards with respect, maintained discipline, and began studying law, history, and psychology. "Know the game better than the man who invented it," he once told a fellow inmate. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the commission continued to operate. Frank Costello stepped up as acting boss, and Meyer Lansky handled financial affairs. Luciano's organization, his true masterpiece, didn't collapse. It evolved. Even imprisoned, Luciano remained an invisible influence, a name whispered in meetings, a phantom voice guiding decisions. For the press, he became both villain and folk hero. Some saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with America's cities. Others saw him as a genius who understood power better than politicians. And as the world moved toward the chaos of World War II, his name lingered in the background, a ghost haunting both the underworld and the government that had tried to bury him. What made Luciano's trial unforgettable wasn't just the conviction. It was the irony that a man who had built a criminal system so disciplined, so corporate, was brought down not by rival gangsters or assassins, but by bureaucracy, paperwork, and the slow grind of justice. The system he had mocked ended up using its own structure, hierarchy, order, accountability, to destroy him. In many ways, the trial symbolized a turning point in American crime. It marked the end of the flamboyant gangster era and the rise of a more shadowed, calculated form of power. The mafia would become quieter, more strategic, just as Luciano had designed. As the prison gates closed behind him, he wasn't thinking of the verdict or Dewey's victory. He was thinking of the blueprint he'd left behind, the commission, the structure, the alliances. He knew that even if he rotted in a cell, the empire would live on. The man was confined, but his idea, organized crime as an enterprise, had already escaped. And for Lucky Luciano, that meant one thing: the game was far from over.